My parents called my 10-year-old daughter's inheritance family money, then spent it on tiered leather seats and a giant screen. I stayed silent until the bank records surfaced, and every stolen dollar pointed straight back to them. My name is Claire. I am 34 years old, a payroll specialist for a mid-sized logistics firm, and a widow. 10 months ago, I stood in my parents' newly renovated basement, staring at a $40,000 custom home theater system, complete with tiered leather recliners and a 100-inch screen. The room smelled of expensive leather and fresh paint. My father was pouring champagne to celebrate the grand reveal with his country club friends. What he did not announce to the room was that every single leather stitch, every pixel on that screen, and every drop of that champagne was paid for using my dead husband's life insurance. It was money meant to protect my 10-year-old daughter Lily. The nightmare actually began 6 months before that basement party. My husband Tom was 36 years old when a sudden massive aneurysm took him from us in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. One minute I was at my desk processing employee timesheets and thinking about what to make for dinner, and the next minute, a doctor I had never met was telling me over the phone that my entire universe had collapsed. Tom left behind a devastating hollow void in our home. He also left behind a mountain of unexpected medical bills from the hospital's frantic, futile attempts to save his life and a life insurance policy for $150,000. Tom had been so specific when he bought that policy. He told me it was strictly designated for Lily to ensure she would never have to struggle if the worst ever happened. The worst did happen, and I was instantly drowning. My grief was a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it nearly impossible to breathe, let alone navigate the endless maze of probate courts, aggressive hospital billing departments, and exorbitant funeral costs. I could barely get out of bed in the morning, finding my only motivation in Lily, who would wake up crying for her father. In the middle of this suffocating darkness, my parents, Richard and Barbara, swooped in. My parents are pillars of our local suburban church and completely obsessed with their country club image. To them, appearance is everything, and vulnerability is a weakness to be hidden. When they arrived at my house the week after the funeral, they did not bring casseroles. They did not sit on the couch and offer a shoulder for me to cry on. They brought filing boxes, manila folders, and a label maker. I remember sitting on my living room sofa, my eyes swollen shut from crying, holding a trembling Lily in my arms. My mother paced around my kitchen, picking up coffee mugs and wiping down counters with sharp, irritated motions. She complained about how messy the house looked, expressing deep concern that neighbors from their church might stop by and judge the state of my living room. Meanwhile, my father immediately commandeered the dining room table. He spread out Tom's financial documents, bank statements, and policy papers like a general planning a ruthless military campaign. There was no emotional support. There was no warmth. There was only what my father proudly called financial management. 2 weeks after we buried Tom, the life insurance check finally cleared. It was the only safety net my husband had managed to leave for our daughter, a beacon of security in a deeply uncertain future. That same evening, my father sat me down at my own kitchen table. He was wearing his usual tailored golf shirt, his hands steepled professionally in front of him. My mother stood right behind his chair, nodding in solemn agreement, presenting a united front of parental authority. "Claire," my father began, his voice dripping with that patronizing tone he always used when he wanted to remind me of my place. "We need to talk about Lily's money. You are in absolutely no condition to manage a sum like this. Look at yourself. You are too hysterical." I blinked at him, my eyes burning with fresh tears. I was not hysterical. I was a grieving widow desperately trying to hold my daughter's shattered world together. I told him that I was a payroll specialist, that I handled accounts for a living, and I knew how to manage money. I explained my plan to put the funds into a secure, high-yield savings account until I felt steady enough to meet with a licensed fiduciary. But my father waved his hand in the air, dismissing my professional competence instantly. "You work in payroll, Claire," he scoffed, his lips curling into a condescending smile. "You process hourly checks for truck drivers and warehouse workers. You do not understand complex investments, tax liabilities, or long-term wealth preservation. If you leave this money sitting around in your possession, you will end up spending it on groceries, utility bills, and expensive grief counseling. This is Lily's college fund. It needs to be aggressively protected from your current emotional state." My mother chimed in right on cue, her voice sickly sweet. "We just want to help Claire. You are so incredibly emotional right now. Let your father take this heavy burden off your shoulders. He knows business. We can set up a joint custodial agreement. That way, the money is locked down and secure, and you will not be tempted to touch it while you are grieving. They tag-teamed me for 3 exhausting hours. They wore me down systematically, exploiting my profound exhaustion, my paralyzing fear of the future, and my desperate childish need to believe that my parents actually had my best interests at heart. My father slid a thick stack of banking forms across the table. He had already filled out all the routing numbers and legal jargon. All they needed was my signature to transfer the $150,000 into a trust account where he held primary joint custodial control. I was so unbelievably tired. My bones ached from the trauma of the past month. I just wanted them to stop talking, to stop looking at me like I was a broken, incompetent child who could not be trusted to survive. I told myself they were my parents. They went to church every single Sunday. They hosted charity dinners and prided themselves on their upstanding community reputation. Surely, they would fiercely protect their only granddaughter's future. So I picked up the pen, and I signed the documents. That single, exhausted signature became the biggest mistake of my entire life. The illusion of their helping hand shattered exactly 1 month later. Lily had been complaining about a severe toothache for days, waking up crying in the middle of the night. I took her to the pediatric dentist only to discover she needed an emergency root canal and a specialized pediatric crown. Because I was still aggressively paying off Tom's outstanding hospital bills and ambulance fees, my own personal savings were entirely wiped out. My checking account was dangerously close to zero. The dentist quoted me $800 out of pocket to perform the procedure that afternoon. It was a highly stressful moment, but as I sat in the waiting room, holding Lily's hand, I felt a small, comforting wave of relief. I knew we had the life insurance funds precisely for sudden, unavoidable emergencies just like this. I stepped out into this quiet hallway of the dental clinic and called my father. I explained the situation clearly, keeping my voice low so Lily would not hear my anxiety. "Dad," I said, "Lily is in terrible pain. She needs an emergency root canal today. I need to authorize a withdrawal of $800 from the custodial account to cover the procedure." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of a televised golf tournament playing in his living room. When my father finally spoke, his voice was tight with irritation and absolute authority. "Claire, I specifically told you that money is locked away for her college education. We cannot just pull from the principal balance every time you encounter a minor inconvenience." "A minor inconvenience," I repeated, my voice rising. Despite my intense efforts to stay calm, she is a 10-year-old girl in agonizing pain. It is an emergency dental procedure. This is exactly what safety nets are created for. It is her money. "No," my father snapped, his tone turning vicious. "It is frivolous spending. You need to learn how to budget your own meager salary instead of running to me for a handout every time life gets hard. I am not authorizing a withdrawal for a toothache. Put it on a credit card and figure it out yourself, like an adult." He hung up on me. I stood there in the sterile, brightly lit hallway of the dental clinic, listening to the dead dial tone, a cold knot forming deep in my stomach. The money was not a handout. It was Tom's money. It was Lily's money. But my father was acting as if it belonged entirely to him, fiercely guarding it from the very child it was meant to protect. I wiped my eyes, walked back into the clinic, and ended up putting the $800 on a high-interest credit card, swallowing my rising panic as I watched the transaction approve on the terminal. I tried desperately to convince myself that my father was just being overly strict, that he truly believed he was preserving the funds for Lily's long-term future. I told myself it was just a generational misunderstanding about money management, but the sharp seed of doubt had been firmly planted in my mind. I did not know it yet, but my father was not protecting Lily's money from me. He was fiercely protecting his own newly acquired slush fund. And the terrible, devastating truth about exactly how he was spending my dead husband's legacy was waiting just around the corner. After that phone call with my father outside the pediatric dental clinic, a cold and terrifying reality set in. I was completely broke. Between the staggering funeral costs, Tom's lingering hospital bills, and Lily's emergency dental crown, my personal bank account was entirely drained. I had absolutely no safety net. My father had made sure of that when he locked away Tom's life insurance money in that joint custodial account. With my modest salary as a payroll specialist, I could no longer afford the rent on the beautiful townhouse where Tom and I had planned to raise our daughter. I was forced to make the most humiliating decision a grieving mother can make. I packed up our entire life into cheap cardboard boxes and moved Lily into my parents' cramped guest room to save money on rent. The guest room was practically a storage closet located right off my mother's laundry room. It had a single twin bed, meaning Lily and I had to squeeze together every single night, trying not to wake each other up. The walls were paper thin. The air in that room always smelled faintly of bleach and my mother's expensive floral perfumes. I felt like a massive failure every time I looked at my sweet daughter sleeping in that tiny, uncomfortable bed. She missed her father. She missed her home. But my parents framed our tragic situation as a grand, benevolent rescue mission. They made sure to tell everyone at their suburban church how they had opened their beautiful doors to their poor, destitute daughter and her fatherless child. They soaked up the sympathy and praise from their wealthy country club friends like a dry sponge. Meanwhile, I was working overtime at the logistics firm, desperately trying to rebuild my savings, just to buy Lily basic school supplies and winter clothes. But almost immediately after we moved into that tiny room, I noticed something strange. My parents' spending habits began to skyrocket, and I mean truly skyrocket. My father, who had always been notoriously cheap when it came to household expenses, suddenly had endless disposable income. Large packages started arriving at the front door every single day. A commercial-grade, stainless steel espresso machine appeared on the kitchen counter out of nowhere. My mother came home from the upscale outdoor mall with designer handbags she proudly displayed on the dining room table. They even upgraded their premium membership at the local country club, boasting loudly about how they finally had the exclusive platinum tier access. I tried hard to ignore it. I told myself they had worked their whole lives and simply had solid retirement savings. But the reality of it gnawed at my stomach. Every morning I would wake up at 5 to commute to my office, packing a sad peanut butter sandwich for lunch because I could not afford to eat at the corporate cafeteria. And every evening, I would come home utterly exhausted to find my parents drinking imported wine and planning luxury weekend getaways to wine country. The sheer contrast between my suffocating poverty and their sudden lavish wealth was dizzying. Still, I pushed the dark suspicion down. I wanted to believe my parents were just enjoying their golden years. I wanted to believe they were good, honest people who loved me. That fragile belief began to completely crumble during our mandatory Sunday dinner 2 weeks later. My younger sister Chloe and her husband Bradley came over to the house. Chloe was the undeniable golden child of the family. She was 5 years younger than me, married straight out of college to a man my parents approved of, and never had to worry about a single bill in her life. Bradley ran a local residential contracting business, though run is a very generous word. He was notoriously terrible with money, constantly chasing flashy business expansions, while Chloe funded her lavish suburban lifestyle through my parents' silent bailouts. Dinner was a massive affair. My mother had catered an expensive prime rib feast served on her finest china, with crystal water glasses. Lily and I sat quietly at the far end of the table. I was just trying to get through the meal, keep my head down, and get Lily to bed so I could prepare for the work week. But Chloe was in a terrible mood. She slammed her wineglass down on the expensive tablecloth and began complaining loudly and bitterly about Bradley's failing business. "I do not know what we are going to do," Chloe whined, glaring across the table at her husband. "The bank is threatening to call the commercial loan on the business equipment. Bradley is completely underwater with his vendors. We cannot even afford the lease on my luxury car next month. It is incredibly embarrassing. I cannot even show my face at the country club right now." Bradley looked down at his plate, his face flushing bright red with shame. I watched the exchange closely, fully expecting my father to deliver one of his famous, booming lectures on financial responsibility. I expected him to tell Chloe to budget her money and figure it out exactly like the brutal lecture he gave me outside the dental clinic when I begged for Lily's money. Instead, the entire dining room went dead silent. My mother dropped her silver fork. It clattered loudly against her plate. She shot a panicked, wide-eyed look directly at my father across the table. It was a look of pure, unfiltered terror. She immediately reached over and grabbed Chloe's arm, digging her fingers into the fabric of her sleeve. "Chloe, please," my mother hissed, her voice trembling with a terrifying, forced sweetness. "We do not discuss unpleasant financial matters at the dinner table, especially not in front of the children. We will talk about this later. Privately." Chloe rolled her eyes and let out an annoyed huff. But my father cleared his throat loudly, giving his golden daughter a sharp, aggressive warning glare. The topic changed instantly to the upcoming church bake sale and the local weather, but my heart was pounding relentlessly against my ribs. I am a payroll specialist. I spend 40 hours a week looking for financial discrepancies, reading subtle body language, and spotting the exact moment when numbers do not add up. That frantic look my mother gave my father was not just uncomfortable. It was the terrified look of someone hiding a massive destructive secret. The very next afternoon, I had to drop off some mail and legal paperwork at Chloe's house because my mother claimed she was too busy to run the errand. I pulled my beat-up 10-year-old sedan into Chloe's pristine, upscale neighborhood. As I pulled up to her manicured driveway, I slammed on the brakes so hard my seatbelt locked. Parked right in front of her 3-car garage was a brand-new, fully loaded luxury SUV. The shiny dealer tags were still bolted to the back. It was a pristine top-of-the-line vehicle that easily cost upwards of $80,000. I sat in my idling car, staring through the windshield at the gleaming metal. Just 12 hours ago at the dinner table, Chloe was crying about the bank calling their commercial loans and losing her car lease. They were supposedly bankrupt. Now she had a brand-new luxury vehicle sitting in her driveway. I felt completely numb. A cold, creeping dread spread from my chest down to my fingertips. I dropped the paperwork in her mailbox with shaking hands and drove straight back to my parents' house. I walked through the front door and found my mother in the lavish kitchen, casually arranging a large bouquet of fresh tulips in a crystal vase. "Mom," I said, trying desperately to keep my voice steady. "I just dropped the papers off at Chloe's house. I saw a brand-new luxury SUV in the driveway. Last night she was crying because they were completely broke and drowning in business debt. How on earth did Bradley afford a new car today?" My mother froze completely. Her back stiffened, and she slowly turned around to face me. Her face was a masterclass in perfect innocent confusion, but her hands were gripping the edges of the granite kitchen island so tightly her knuckles were stark white. "Oh, that," she said, her voice artificially bright and breezy. "Bradley had a sudden windfall with a new client, and your father decided to help them out just a little bit. He cashed out some old municipal bonds he had been holding onto for decades. It was just a small family loan to get them through a rough patch. You know how much your father loves to help his girls." I stared at her. Old municipal bonds. My father, the strict financial disciplinarian who refused to let me access $800 of my own dead husband's life insurance to fix his granddaughter's agonizing toothache, had magically found $80,000 in old bonds overnight to buy a luxury car for his golden child. "Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a trembling whisper. Why would Dad cash out his precious retirement bonds for Bradley's car, but refuse to help Lily when she was crying in physical pain? My mother's eyes narrowed into dark, cold slits. The sweet, breezy facade vanished instantly, replaced by a vicious cruelty I had never fully seen before. "Claire, do not be ungrateful, and do not be jealous," she snapped, taking a threatening step toward me. "Your father's personal investments are absolutely none of your business. We are providing a solid roof over your head. You and Lily are eating our food, using our water, and using our electricity for free. Chloe needed a safe, reliable vehicle for her family. You have absolutely no right to question how your father spends his hard-earned money. Do not create drama in this house where there is none." She turned her back on me, picked up her scissors, and resumed cutting the stems of the tulips. I stood in the kitchen, the heavy silence ringing in my ears like a siren. I did not argue. I turned around and walked slowly back to the tiny, cramped guest room. I sat down on the edge of the twin bed where my daughter slept every night. My hands were shaking so violently I had to press them against my knees. My gut was screaming at me with a terrifying clarity. As a financial professional, I know that money does not just magically appear from old forgotten bonds precisely when someone goes bankrupt. Money always leaves a trail. I did not have the physical proof yet, but as I sat in that suffocating little room, the horrible, sickening realization washed over me like ice water. My parents were not helping me survive my grief. They were actively bleeding my daughter dry. The suffocating reality of living in my parents' guest room had become a daily exercise in psychological endurance. Every single morning, I woke up at 5, untangling myself from my daughter Lily, so I would not wake her in our cramped twin bed. I would silently get dressed in the dark laundry room, making sure not to disturb the pristine quiet of my parents' massive suburban house. I was working 50 hours a week as a payroll specialist, poring over employee timesheets and corporate tax deductions, just trying to scrape together enough money to buy our own groceries. Meanwhile, my parents were living like they had won the lottery. The sheer volume of Amazon packages piled on the front porch every afternoon was sickening. I tried to keep my head down and focus entirely on Lily, but the fragile peace I was trying to maintain shattered completely on a rainy Tuesday evening. Lily came home from school with red, puffy eyes. She was holding her school-issued laptop against her chest like a broken toy. She was in the 5th grade, and her entire science fair project was saved on that hard drive. When I opened the laptop and pressed the power button, nothing happened. The screen remained dead and black. I spent an hour troubleshooting. I plugged it into different outlets. I held down the reset keys. Nothing worked. The next morning, I took it to a local tech repair shop on my lunch break. The technician took one look at it and shook his head. The motherboard was completely fried. He told me it would cost $400 to replace the internal components, and even then there was no guarantee the data could be salvaged. A brand new, basic laptop for her schoolwork would cost roughly $500. I sat in the driver's seat of my 10-year-old sedan and opened my banking app on my phone. My checking account balance was exactly $42.15. I had not even recovered from putting her emergency pediatric dental crown on my high-interest credit card the month before. My credit limit was entirely maxed out. I stared at the dashboard while the rain pounded against my windshield, feeling the familiar, crushing weight of failure pressing down on my lungs. I was a financial professional who could not even afford to buy her child a school computer, but then a thought pierced through my panic. I did not need to use my own depleted checking account. Lily had $150,000 sitting in a high-yield custodial trust account. It was her money. It was the life insurance payout from her deceased father meant specifically to protect her from this exact type of hardship. My father had explicitly claimed he was locking the funds away to prevent frivolous spending, but a computer for her 5th grade education was the definition of an essential educational expense. I was legally a joint custodian on that account. I did not need to ask my father for permission. I did not need to beg for a handout and endure another brutal lecture about my budgeting skills. I could simply walk into the local branch, present my identification, and request a cashier's check for $500. I decided right then and there to bypass his control. I drove straight to the main branch of the bank where my father had set up the trust. The lobby was quiet and smelled of expensive floor wax and stale coffee. I walked up to the teller window, feeling a strange mix of guilt and fierce maternal determination. The teller was a young woman with a polite smile. I handed her my driver license, my social security card, and the printed account number my father had given me on the day I signed the custodial paperwork. I explained that I was the joint custodian and needed to make a small withdrawal for a minor beneficiary's educational expenses. The teller smiled warmly and began typing the account number into her terminal. I stood there mentally calculating how fast I could get to the electronics store before my lunch hour ended. But the teller stopped typing. Her polite smile faded into a tight, confused frown. She clicked her mouse a few times, leaned closer to her monitor, and then looked back up at me. "Mrs. Miller," she said softly, "please give me just one moment. I need to get my branch manager." My stomach did a nervous flip. I assumed there was some sort of security hold on the account because of the large balance. When you have $150,000 sitting in a trust, banks are naturally cautious about over-the-counter withdrawals. I nodded and stepped back from the window. A few minutes later, an older man in a sharp gray suit walked out from a glass-walled office in the back. He introduced himself as the branch manager and asked me to follow him into his private office. He closed the door behind us and gestured for me to sit down. Mrs. Miller, the manager, began folding his hands on his desk. He was not looking at me with the professional distance of a banker. He was looking at me with profound, unmistakable pity. "I am looking at the custodial account tied to this identification. Can you confirm the exact amount you believe should be in this trust today?" I swallowed hard. $150,000, I said clearly, plus whatever minor interest has accrued over the last 10 months. The manager looked down at his screen and let out a long, heavy sigh. "Mrs. Miller, I'm so deeply sorry to be the one to tell you this. There must be a catastrophic misunderstanding between you and the primary account holder. This account does not have a balance of $150,000. This account is currently overdrawn by $42. The air vanished from the room. The walls seemed to tilt inward. I sat there in the plush leather chair, staring at his mouth, absolutely certain I had misheard him. Overdrawn, I whispered, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. That is impossible. It is a life insurance payout. It was deposited 10 months ago. We have not touched it. My father said it was locked in a high-yield portfolio. The manager turned his monitor slightly so I could see the screen, though the numbers blurred together through my rising tears. According to our ledger, the original deposit cleared successfully 10 months ago, he explained gently. But starting approximately 6 weeks after the initial deposit, large systematic wire transfers began moving out of the account. There were wire transfers for $10,000, $20,000, and even one transfer for $40,000. The final withdrawal was processed 3 days ago, which triggered an overdraft fee, leaving the balance negative. My mind raced, trying to process the impossible mathematics of what he was showing me. I am a payroll specialist. I know exactly what a wire transfer means. It means liquid cash was intentionally and permanently relocated to an outside institution. Where did the money go? I demanded, my hands gripping the armrests of the chair so tightly my fingers went numb. Who authorized those wires? I am a joint custodian. I never authorized a single transfer. The manager looked at me with deep sympathy. Because you are a secondary custodian on a joint setup, the primary account holder, Richard, possessed the unilateral authority to initiate external transfers. I cannot disclose the exact destination routing numbers without a formal fraud subpoena, but I can confirm that every single wire was initiated and authorized by Richard. The funds are gone. Mrs. Miller, the account is entirely empty. I do not remember walking out of the bank. I do not remember unlocking my car or putting the keys in the ignition. The entire drive back to my parents' house was a terrifying, suffocating blur of panic and denial. It could not be true. My father was a pillar of his church. He was a respected member of the community. He was the man who had scolded me for wanting to use $800 for Lily's dental emergency, claiming he was aggressively protecting her future. But the bank ledger did not lie. Every single cent of my dead husband's legacy had been drained. The endless Amazon packages, the luxury espresso machine, the brand new $80,000 luxury SUV sitting in my sister Chloe's driveway. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with a sickening, violent force. They had not cashed out old municipal bonds. They had stolen my child's future to fund their own luxury lifestyle. I pulled into the driveway and slammed the car into park. The house was empty. My parents were out running errands, likely spending more of Tom's hard-earned money. I ran through the front door, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs, and sprinted straight down the hallway toward my father's home office. I knew he kept all of his personal financial records, bank statements, and tax documents locked in a heavy oak filing cabinet in the corner of that room. If I could just get my hands on the physical paper trails, I could see exactly where every dollar went. I reached for the brass doorknob of his office, twisted it, and slammed my shoulder against the wood. The door did not budge. I stepped back, confused. My father had worked from that home office for 20 years. He always bragged about his open-door policy. He never ever locked that door. I looked down at the handle and my breath caught in my throat. Bolted directly into the heavy oak doorframe was a brand-new industrial-grade steel padlock. The metal was shiny and completely untouched. It had been installed recently. I grabbed the heavy steel lock and rattled it violently. It was a glaring, undeniable physical manifestation of their guilt. You do not install an industrial padlock on a residential home office door unless you are fiercely guarding a massive destructive secret. I tried jamming a paperclip into the keyhole. I tried kicking the door near the hinges. Nothing worked. The reality of my situation washed over me like a freezing ocean wave. I was trapped in the house of the people who had robbed my grieving daughter blind. 20 minutes later, I heard the heavy thud of the garage door opening. I stood in the grand foyer, my fists clenched at my sides, as my parents walked through the front door. They were laughing warmly. My father was carrying 2 large shopping bags from a high-end boutique downtown. My mother was holding a brand new designer coffee cup. They looked like the picture-perfect, wealthy suburban couple. "Where is it?" I shouted. My voice echoed off the high ceilings of the foyer, loud and terrifying. My mother dropped her coffee cup. It shattered against the hardwood floor, spilling dark liquid everywhere. My father froze the boutique bags dangling from his hands. "Where is what, Claire?" my father demanded, his face instantly twisting into a mask of aggressive irritation. "What is wrong with you? You are screaming like a lunatic. I went to the bank today," I said, my entire body shaking with pure adrenaline and rage. "I went to get a cashier's check to buy Lily a new school laptop because her old one broke." The branch manager brought me into his office. He told me the account is overdrawn by $42. He told me that $150,000 was wired out over the last 10 months. "Oh, where's my husband's money, Dad?" For one fraction of a second, I saw a flash of genuine naked panic in my father's eyes. His shoulders stiffened. He glanced quickly at my mother, who had gone completely pale, staring at me with her mouth hanging open. But my father was a master manipulator. He did not apologize. He did not break down and confess. He executed a rapid, flawless pivot into aggressive indignation. He dropped the shopping bags onto the floor and took 3 large, intimidating steps toward me, towering over my smaller frame. "How dare you!" he roared, his face turning a deep, angry shade of purple. "How dare you go behind my back and snoop around financial institutions questioning my authority? You have absolutely no idea what you are looking at. It is a zero balance." I screamed right back at him, refusing to back away. "Zero. You wired it all out. You stole from a grieving 10-year-old girl." "I did not steal anything, you ignorant child," he shouted, pointing a thick, aggressive finger directly in my face. I moved the funds. "I told you on the very first day that you were too emotional and too incompetent to handle long-term wealth. I transferred the money into a highly diversified private investment portfolio. It is locked in long-term capital growth assets to maximize the yield for Lily's college tuition." "You work in payroll, Claire," he sneered, spitting the words at me like venom. "You process hourly wages. You do not understand capital gains. You do not understand market liquidity. The bank manager only saw the transfer out of the custodial account. He does not have access to my private investment brokerage. I am fiercely protecting that money from your erratic, frivolous spending habits. Show me the portfolio," I demanded, my voice trembling with furious tears. "Open the padlock on your office door right now and show me the paper statements for this supposed private investment account. Prove to me that the money is safe." My father's expression turned utterly lethal. He stepped so close to me I could smell the strong, expensive cologne he had recently started wearing. "You listen to me very carefully, Claire," he growled, his voice dropping to a terrifying quiet menace. "You are living under my roof. You are eating my food. You are sleeping in my house for free because your dead husband failed to provide you with enough security to survive on your own. I stepped up and rescued you from the gutter." My mother quickly moved to his side, placing her hand on his arm. "Richard is right, Claire," she chimed in, her voice dripping with toxic, weaponized concern. "You are acting completely hysterical again. This is exactly why we took control of the finances. Your grief is making you paranoid and delusional. If you ever question my integrity again," my father continued, his eyes locked onto mine with absolute hatred, "if you ever cause this kind of insane, dramatic scene in my house again, I will pack your cheap little cardboard boxes and throw you and that child out onto the street tonight. Do you understand me? I will legally evict you, and I will let you figure out how to survive on your pathetic payroll salary." I stood there in the foyer, the shattered pieces of my mother's coffee cups scattered across the floor between us. I looked past my father's shoulder down the long, dark hallway. Peeking out from the cracked door of the cramped guest room was Lily. Her small face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, as she listened to her grandfather threaten to throw us out into the rain. I realized in that exact moment that I was completely trapped. I had no money. I had no credit. I had no physical proof of their theft because the evidence was locked behind an industrial steel padlock. If I pushed him right now, he would follow through on his threat, and Lily would be sleeping in the backseat of my car tonight. I had to survive this. I had to swallow my pride, play the obedient, hysterical widow, and wait for my moment to strike. I lowered my head, took a slow, agonizing breath, and whispered that I was sorry. My father smirked, adjusted his jacket, and told me to clean up the spilled coffee. But as I grabbed the paper towels and knelt on the floor, I made a silent, unbreakable promise to myself. I was going to find the proofs, and I was going to destroy their entire world. I spent the next 3 days living in a state of suffocating, terrifying silence. The quiet inside my parents' massive suburban house was not peaceful. It was heavy and oppressive, like the thick, unbreathable air right before a violent tornado touches down. My father had made his absolute authority and his ruthless threat perfectly clear. If I caused any more drama, if I dared to ask any more questions about my dead husband's life insurance money, he would legally evict me and my 10-year-old daughter without a second thought. I had exactly $42 to my name. I had a maxed-out credit card from paying for Lily's emergency dental crown. I had absolutely nowhere else to go, so I did the only thing a desperate mother can do when her child's basic survival is on the line. I swallowed my pride, lowered my eyes to the floor, and played the part of the broken, obedient, grateful widow. I woke up every morning before the sun rose. I made Lily her breakfast, whispering to her that everything was going to be fine. I kissed her forehead before the school bus arrived, and then I drove my beat-up car to my logistics firm to process payroll. I sat at my desk looking at complex spreadsheets and tax codes, but my mind was endlessly spinning, replaying that moment in the bank manager's office over and over again. My father had claimed he moved the $150,000 into a private high-yield investment portfolio. He aggressively claimed he was protecting the money from my erratic, hysterical grief. But the brand-new $80,000 luxury SUV sitting in my sister Chloe's driveway told a completely different story. I knew he was lying. I knew it deep in my bones. I just did not have the physical proof yet. I knew better than to try the locked door of his home office again. That shiny industrial steel padlock was a constant, mocking reminder that I was a helpless prisoner in my own parents' home. I decided to wait. I decided to watch. People who steal money, especially people who steal large sums of money out of sheer greed and arrogant entitlement, always make a careless mistake. They always leave a paper trail. I just needed to be patient and sharp enough to find it. My opportunity arrived 4 days later on a Saturday afternoon. My mother, Barbara, was hosting her monthly church ladies' luncheon. This was not a casual gathering of close friends sharing a meal. This was a highly competitive, meticulously staged performance designed to showcase my parents' perceived wealth, their immaculate taste, and their moral superiority to the entire suburban neighborhood. My mother had spent the entire morning barking sharp orders at me. I was tasked with polishing the silver serving trays, arranging the expensive floral centerpieces she had custom ordered, and setting out delicate plates of imported cheeses and cucumber finger sandwiches. When the guests finally arrived, I was expected to fade entirely into the background and act as the unpaid, invisible catering staff. I walked around the grand living room in a plain black dress, silently refilling crystal glasses with iced tea and collecting discarded linen napkins. The wealthy women from the church wore pastel cardigans and heavy gold jewelry. They sat on my mother's pristine white sofas, gossiping about other congregation members and loudly praising my mother for her incredible charity and endless Christian virtue. "Oh, Barbara," one of the women cooed, delicately wiping her mouth with a napkin. "You are just an absolute saint for taking poor Claire and little Lily in during such a dark time. It is such a blessing that they have a strong, financially secure family to fall back on. It must be such a heavy burden on you and Richard, but the Lord sees your sacrifice." My mother placed a manicured hand over her heart and offered a modest, deeply fake smile to the room. "We do what the Lord calls us to do," my mother said, her voice dripping with artificial humility. "Family always comes first. Richard and I just want to make sure Claire has a safe, comfortable place to heal her broken heart. It is a sacrifice of our golden years, of course, but a mother's love knows no bounds. We are happy to provide for them." I stood less than 5 feet away, holding a heavy silver tray of sandwiches, and my stomach violently churned. I almost gagged, right there in the living room. A mother's love. My mother had stood in the foyer just days earlier and watched in silent approval as my father threatened to throw her grieving daughter and her 10-year-old granddaughter out onto the cold street. She had actively supported his cruelty, but I kept my face completely blank. I offered the silver tray to the woman, poured more iced tea with a steady hand, and quietly retreated back to the kitchen. I washed the dirty dishes. I scrubbed the granite countertops until they shined. I played the perfect invisible servant while they celebrated their own fake righteousness, completely unaware that their lavish lifestyle was built on stolen money. By 4 in the afternoon, the last of the church ladies finally walked out the front door, and drove away in their luxury sedans. My mother collapsed dramatically onto the living room sofa, complaining loudly about how exhausted she was from playing the gracious host. She told me to finish cleaning the kitchen, sweep the floors, and take out all the heavy garbage bags before I even thought about sitting down to rest. She then marched upstairs to her master suite to take a nap. My father was at the country club playing his usual Saturday round of golf. Lily was safely tucked away in our cramped guest room, reading a library book. I was completely alone on the first floor of the house. I gathered the remaining dirty plates from the dining room, loaded the dishwasher, and wiped down the deep stainless steel sink. I pulled the heavy plastic trash bag out of the tall kitchen cylinder, pulling the drawstrings tightly together. But as I lifted the bag to carry it outside, the bottom caught on the sharp metal edge of the can. The thin plastic tore completely open. A disgusting mess of wet coffee grounds, crumpled napkins, fruit peels, and discarded mail spilled across the pristine kitchen tiles. I let out a frustrated breath and knelt down on the hard floor to clean up the foul-smelling spill. I started grabbing the damp napkins and tossing them into a fresh trash bag. But as I reached for a cluster of discarded junk mail and wet coffee filters, my hand brushed against a heavy, glossy piece of paper. It had been shoved all the way down to the absolute bottom of the trash bin. It was crumpled tightly into a hard, dense ball deliberately hidden beneath layers of ordinary kitchen waste. My professional payroll instincts immediately kicked into high gear. You do not crush a piece of paper that violently and bury it at the absolute bottom of the trash unless you desperately want to make sure nobody ever finds it. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled the crumpled ball out of the mess. I stood up and walked over to the kitchen island. I slowly and carefully smoothed out the glossy, thick page against the cold granite countertop. It was an official invoice. It bore the sleek, modern logo of a high-end custom audiovisual contracting firm based in the wealthiest commercial district of the city. The client name listed at the top was Richard Miller. The installation address was my parents' home. I scanned the itemized list of charges, my heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. Premium acoustic wall paneling. Surround sound theater audio processing system. Custom tiered wooden platform construction. 6 custom-built heated leather reclining theater seats. 100-inch ambient light rejecting projection screen. High-definition laser projector. The list went on, detailing the meticulous construction of an absolutely massive, state-of-the-art luxury home theater system. The installation location noted on the invoice was the basement. A basement my father had padlocked and declared completely off-limits 2 months ago, due to what he called dangerous foundation issues and mold treatments. I looked down at the bottom of the long invoice. The grand total was exactly $40,000. Just the 6 heated leather chairs alone cost more than the emergency pediatric dental crown my father had viciously refused to pay for. Below the grand total was a bold red stamp that read, "Paid in full." But it was the single line of text printed directly beneath that red stamp that made all the air vanish from my lungs. The payment method was listed as a direct wire transfer, and right next to that, the contractor had printed the last 4 digits of the originating bank account to confirm the massive transaction. I stared at those 4 digits. They burned into my vision. I knew those numbers perfectly. I had stared at those exact same 4 digits on the custodial trust paperwork the day my father convinced me to sign my dead husband's life insurance away. It was Lily's account. It was my 10-year-old daughter's emergency safety net, her future college tuition, the money my husband Tom had worked 60 hours a week to save. The money meant to replace the father she had tragically lost. My father had not moved her money into a secure, high-yield private investment portfolio. He had not locked it away to protect it from my grief, like he righteously claimed in the foyer. He had not cashed out old municipal bonds to buy my sister a luxury car. The horrifying, undeniable truth was right there on the granite counter in front of me. They had stolen $40,000 of a grieving child's money to build a luxury movie theater in their basement so they could drink champagne and entertain their country club friends. And they had used another $80,000 to buy a status symbol for his favorite daughter. They had completely and maliciously liquidated my dead husband's legacy for leather seats, a giant television screen, and a new car. I stood in the center of the pristine kitchen, holding the smoothed-out invoice. The crushing, paralyzing grief that had weighed me down for 10 agonizing months instantly evaporated. The absolute terror of being thrown out on the street completely vanished from my mind. In their place, a cold, absolute, and terrifying rage flooded my veins. My parents had treated me like a naive, hysterical widow. They thought I was too weak, too broken by my husband's death, and too stupid to fight back. They thought a heavy steel padlock and a few loud, aggressive threats would keep me silent and compliant forever, but they had made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. They forgot who I was. They forgot that I was a senior payroll specialist. I track millions of dollars for a living. I find missing decimals, I audit fraudulent corporate accounts, and I absolutely destroy people who lie on their financial reports. I carefully took out my phone and snapped crystal-clear, high-resolution photos of the invoice from every possible angle, making sure the account numbers, the dates, and the contractor's contact information were perfectly legible. I emailed the photos directly to my secure personal account and backed them up to a hidden cloud drive. Then I crumpled the invoice back into a tight ball, shoved it deep into the dirty coffee grounds, and tied up the trash bag. I walked the garbage out to the curb with a steady, unshakable calm. The tears were completely gone. The obedient, terrified daughter had died right there in that kitchen. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I was going to find a way to access the rest of those bank records in his locked office. I was going to secure the undisputed legal proof of their felony wire fraud. And then, I was going to absolutely and systematically ruin them. I did not scream. I did not fall to the floor and cry. The time for tears had passed the moment I smoothed out that crumpled invoice on the granite kitchen island. The weeping, helpless widow they had so easily manipulated was gone. In her place stood a woman who spent 40 hours a week tracking missing decimals, auditing complex corporate accounts, and hunting down financial discrepancies for a living. My parents had treated me like an ignorant child, assuming my grief made me stupid. They forgot that I was a senior payroll specialist. I knew exactly how to follow the money, and I knew that arrogant people who steal always leave a paper trail. I just needed the right moment to perform my audit. That moment arrived 2 days later, on a Sunday morning. Sunday was the most important day of the week for Richard and Barbara. It was their weekly opportunity to parade their perceived moral superiority and immense wealth in front of the entire suburban congregation. The morning was filled with the usual suffocating routine. The house smelled of expensive dark roast coffee and my mother's heavy floral perfume. I sat quietly at the kitchen table, feeding Lily her cereal, while my parents bustled around us preparing for their performance. My father wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, checking his gold watch with aggressive self-importance. My mother wore a pristine cream-colored dress, and her favorite pearl necklace, loudly complaining that the dry cleaner had not pressed her silk scarf correctly. They looked like the ultimate picture of respectable, upstanding American success. They were the kind of people who served on the church financial committee and hosted charity dinners. They were the kind of people who would loudly pray for the poor while secretly robbing their own grieving granddaughter blind. "Are you absolutely sure you will not join us for service today, Claire?" My mother asked, her voice dripping with that fake, weaponized concern she used whenever she wanted to sound benevolent. "Pastor Miller is giving a wonderful sermon on family unity and the blessings of financial stewardship. I really think it would do your fragile spirit some good to get out of the house." I looked down at my coffee mug, keeping my face perfectly blank. "I am just feeling a bit under the weather today, Mom," I said softly, playing the part of the exhausted, defeated daughter to absolute perfection. "Lily has some homework to catch up on, and I think I just need to rest in my room." My father let out a heavy, judgmental sigh, adjusting his expensive silk tie in the hallway mirror. "Suit yourself, Claire," he muttered dismissively. "But you cannot wallow in your grief forever. At some point, you need to pull yourself together and start contributing to this household. We cannot carry your dead weight indefinitely." I swallowed, the burning rage rising in my throat, and simply nodded. "Have a good time at church," I whispered. The heavy oak front door finally clicked shut. A few seconds later, I heard the mechanical hum of the garage door opening, the low purr of their luxury sedan reversing down the driveway, and the tires fading into the distance. I stood perfectly still in the center of the kitchen, waiting for 5 full minutes, just to be absolutely certain they had left the neighborhood. The massive suburban house settled into a deep, echoing silence. I turned to my sweet, 10-year-old daughter. "Lily," I said gently, crouching down to her eye level. "Mommy needs to do some very important paperwork for work right now. I need you to stay in our room, put your headphones on, and watch your favorite movie on your tablet. Do not come out until I come get you. Can you be my brave girl and do that for me?" Lily nodded, her big brown eyes looking at me with total trust. She grabbed her tablet and hurried into the cramped guest room, shutting the door tightly behind her. As soon as she was safe, my entire demeanor shifted. The heavy fog of depression lifted, replaced by a cold, sharp, calculating focus. My payroll brain completely took over. I walked out of the kitchen and headed straight up the grand sweeping staircase toward my parents' master bedroom suite. My father was an old-school businessman. He did not trust digital cloud storage or paperless banking. He printed absolutely everything. Every bank statement, every tax return, every single receipt had to be physically filed away in his locked home office on the first floor. But I knew exactly where he kept the key to that heavy steel padlock he had so proudly bolted to the office door. When I was a teenager living in this house, I used to put away his clean laundry. I knew that he always hid his most important personal keys in the top right drawer of his solid mahogany dresser, tucked neatly inside an old velvet watchbox. I pushed open the door to the master suite. The room was massive, decorated in pristine white and gold, resembling a luxury hotel suite more than a bedroom. I walked straight to the tall mahogany dresser. I pulled open the top right drawer, pushing aside neatly rolled dress socks and silk pocket squares. There it was, the faded black velvet box. I opened it, and resting on the soft cushion was a single heavy brass key. I grabbed the key, my heart hammering a slow, deliberate rhythm against my ribs. I walked back down the stairs and marched straight down the hallway to the home office. I stood in front of the heavy wooden door and slid the brass key into the shiny new industrial padlock. It turned with a smooth, heavy click. I pulled the lock free, removed it from the metal latch, and pushed the door open. The office smelled of stale cigar smoke and expensive leather polish. A massive cherry wood executive desk dominated the center of the room, but my eyes went immediately to the corner. There it was, a towering 4-drawer fireproof metal filing cabinet, the central hub of my father's financial empire. I walked over to it and pulled the top drawer open. It was organized with meticulous, obsessive precision. Hundreds of green hanging folders with neat typed labels lined the metal tracks. I scanned the tabs quickly. Mortgage, utilities, country club dues, auto leases. I moved to the second drawer, investment portfolios, retirement bonds, and then tucked in the very back of the third drawer I found it. A thick, bulging folder with a crisp white label that read, Lily Custodial Trust Account. I pulled the heavy folder out of the cabinet. I did not sit in his expensive leather executive chair. I sat right there on the woven Persian rug in the middle of the floor. I opened the folder and began pulling out the monthly bank statements, spreading the thick stacks of paper across the floor in chronological order. I took a deep breath, mentally shutting off the part of my brain that belonged to a grieving widow and a betrayed daughter. I became an auditor. I looked at the very first statement dated exactly 10 months ago. There it was, the initial deposit from the life insurance company, $150,000, the exact numerical value of my dead husband's final attempt to protect his little girl. The starting balance looked so pure, so solid. But as I picked up the statement for the second month, the true horror of my parents' greed began to reveal itself in stark black and white ink. The paper trail was an absolute bloodbath. My father had looked me directly in the eyes and promised he was aggressively protecting this money in a private, high-yield investment portfolio. He claimed he was preserving it for Lily's college tuition, but there were no transfers to a brokerage firm. There were no mutual funds or secure government bonds. Every single outgoing transaction was a direct wire transfer to a checking account that I immediately recognized as my parents' primary personal bank account. I started tracking the dates and the amounts, matching them in my mind to the events of the past 10 months. On the 15th of October, just 6 weeks after Tom died, there was a withdrawal of $10,000. I remembered that week clearly. That was the exact same week my parents proudly announced they had finally secured their exclusive platinum tier upgrade at the local country club. They had hosted a massive celebration dinner and bragged about how their smart financial planning had paid off. They bought their social status using my dead husband's money. I moved to the November statement. There was a direct wire transfer of $15,000. The memo line literally read, Napa Valley Resort and Spa. My hands tightened around the paper. I remembered freezing in our tiny guest room that month because my father refused to turn up the heat to save money on the electric bill. While my daughter and I slept in multiple layers of clothing, my parents were drinking expensive wine in California, funded entirely by a grieving child's inheritance. But the deepest, most agonizing betrayal was waiting for me on the January statement. I stared at a massive outgoing wire transfer for $30,000. I traced my finger across the date. January 12th. The numbers burned into my vision. I closed my eyes and let the memory of that exact week wash over me. That was the week of our mandatory Sunday family dinner. That was the night my golden sister, Chloe, had slammed her wine glass on the table and cried about her husband Bradley's failing contracting business. She had whined about the bank calling their commercial loans and losing the lease on her luxury car, and right there, printed on the official bank ledger, was the undeniable proof. The very next morning after that dinner, my father had logged into Lily's trust account and wired $30,000 directly to Bradley's business checking account to bail him out. He did not cash out old municipal bonds. He did not dip into his own retirement savings to help his favorite daughter. He stole the money directly from a 10-year-old girl who had just lost her father. I kept reading, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps as the sheer scale of the theft unfolded across the pages. February statement. $40,000 withdrawn. The exact amount of the crumpled invoice I had found in the trash for the luxury basement home theater system. March statement. $20,000 withdrawn for a brand new luxury SUV, down payment for Chloe. April statement. $5,000 for custom landscaping in the backyard. May statement. $8,000 for my mother's designer wardrobe shopping spree at the upscale outdoor mall. By the time I reached the most recent statement from last week, the bottom line confirmed the terrifying truth the branch manager had told me. The ending balance was a negative $42. $150,000. Gone. Evaporated. Spent on leather recliners, country club memberships, luxury vacations, and bailing out a golden sister who never worked a day in her life. They had not just lost the money in a bad investment. They had not made a foolish financial mistake. They had consciously, deliberately, and maliciously liquidated a grieving child's future purely for their own entertainment and social status. They looked at Tom's tragic sudden death and did not see a devastating family loss. They saw a personal lottery win. They saw a free, unsupervised bank account that could fund the wealthy lifestyle they felt deeply entitled to but could no longer afford on their own. They treated my trauma as their ultimate financial windfall. I sat on the floor of that home office completely surrounded by the physical evidence of their monstrous greed. The depth of their deception was staggering. Every time my father scolded me for buying Lily new shoes, every time my mother complained about the cost of our groceries, every time they demanded I show gratitude for letting us sleep in their cramped laundry room closet, they were actively draining the very funds that could have bought us our own beautiful home. I did not feel sad anymore. The paralyzing, suffocating grief that had ruled my life for 10 months was entirely burned away by a brilliant white-hot clarity. I was a payroll specialist. I understood numbers better than anyone in this family. And looking at these statements, I realized my parents had made a catastrophic error. They had left a perfect, unbroken chain of evidence. They had documented their own financial crimes with absolute precision. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. My hands were no longer shaking. They were perfectly still. I opened the camera application and began photographing every single page. I captured the account numbers, the dates, the wire transfer destinations, and the exact dollar amounts. I photographed the negative balance on the final page. I took over 50 high-resolution pictures, making sure the lighting was perfect and the text was undeniable. I emailed the entire batch of photos to a secure, encrypted folder that my parents did not even know existed. I was building a completely bulletproof audit file. I knew that confronting them right now, yelling at them when they returned from church, would accomplish absolutely nothing. My father would just lie, manipulate, and legally evict me before I could secure a lawyer. I had to be smarter than that. I had to be colder than that. I carefully gathered all the bank statements and placed them back into the thick green hanging folder. I slid the folder back into its exact position in the third drawer of the filing cabinet. I pushed the heavy metal drawer shut, letting it close with a soft, satisfying click. I walked out of the office, locked the door, and secured the shiny steel padlock exactly as I had found it. I walked upstairs, placed the brass key back inside the velvet watchbox in my father's dresser, and closed the drawer. When my parents returned from church an hour later, I was sitting at the kitchen table helping Lily with her math homework. I looked up and gave my mother a soft, tired smile. I asked my father how the sermon on family unity and financial stewardship went. He puffed out his chest, completely unaware that his empire of lies was already crumbling, and told me it was a brilliant message about trusting the head of the household. I just nodded and agreed with him. Because I knew the audit was complete, the evidence was secured, and the absolute destruction of their perfect suburban lives was only a matter of time. I sat on the floor of my father's home office with the bank statements spread out around me. The shock of seeing a negative $42 balance on my daughter's trust account had initially paralyzed me. But as a payroll specialist, my professional instincts quickly overrode my panic. I knew that knowing where the money went was only half the battle. I needed to know exactly how it was moved. When you deal with large corporate accounts or custodial trusts, moving massive sums of money is never as simple as clicking a button on a computer screen. Banks have security protocols. They have fraud prevention measures. I remembered the day my father pressured me into signing the initial custodial agreement. The bank manager had explicitly explained the rules of the account to both of us. Because the account held a minor's life insurance payout, it was set up with a dual signature mandate for any withdrawal exceeding $10,000. Neither of us was supposed to be able to touch the bulk of Lily's money without the other person physically signing off on the transaction. Yet I was looking at bank statements showing wire transfers of $20,000, $30,000, and $40,000. I reached back into the thick green hanging folder and pulled out the physical transfer authorization receipts. My father kept everything. He was a man who prided himself on his meticulous record-keeping, completely arrogant in his belief that nobody would ever dare to check his files. I laid the heavy stock bank receipts on the woven Persian rug, right next to the corresponding monthly statements. I picked up the receipt for the $40,000 wire transfer. This was the money that had funded their luxury home theater in the basement. I scanned down to the bottom right corner of the page, searching for the authorization section. There were 2 signature lines printed on the form. On the primary custodian line, my father's signature was scrawled in his heavy, aggressive blue ink. I moved my eyes to the secondary custodian line. My breath caught in my throat. Right there on official bank documentation was my own signature. I brought the paper closer to my face, my hands trembling violently. I stared at the curves of the letters. It was my name. It was my exact handwriting. The way the loop of the C swept upward, the slight sharp angle of the R, the hurried slant of the E at the end. It was the exact signature I used hundreds of times a week when authorizing payroll documents at work. It was absolutely perfect. But I had never signed this document. I had never even seen this document until this very moment. A wave of profound icy nausea rolled through my stomach. My father had not just bypassed my authority. He had not just exploited a banking loophole. He had sat at his heavy cherry wood executive desk, taken out a pen, and meticulously forged his own grieving daughter's signature to steal from his 10-year-old granddaughter. He had studied my handwriting. He had practiced it until he could replicate it flawlessly. He had weaponized my own identity to commit a massive financial crime. This was no longer just a case of terrible financial mismanagement or a gross breach of family trust. This was felony forgery. This was grand larceny. My father had crossed a legal line that carried severe federal penalties. He had risked everything, including his own freedom, just to buy leather recliners and imported wine. I dropped the paper onto the rug and grabbed the receipt for the $30,000 transfer to my brother-in-law Bradley's failing business. I looked at the bottom of the page. My signature was there too. Forged again. I checked the receipt for the $20,000 luxury SUV down payment. Forged. Every single time a major withdrawal was made, my father had calmly and deliberately impersonated me. The level of calculated malice required to do something like that to your own child was entirely beyond my comprehension. While I was upstairs in a cramped guest room, weeping into my pillow for my dead husband, my father was sitting in this very office, perfectly forging my name to drain the last remaining piece of security Tom had left behind for our little girl. I felt a sudden, desperate need to understand how deep this betrayal truly went. My father was incredibly old school when it came to his correspondence. He did not trust digital folders or email archives. He firmly believed that if something was important, it needed to be printed on physical paper and filed away. I reached back into the filing cabinet, digging past the official bank documents and tax forms. Near the very back of the drawer, I felt a thick stack of standard printer paper held together by a heavy binder clip. I pulled it out and rested it on my lap. It was a stack of printed email threads. The top page was dated in late December, right around the time Chloe and Bradley were supposedly facing total financial ruin. I began to read the printed text. The email was from my younger sister Chloe, sent directly to my father's personal email address. The subject line read simply, "Urgent business loan." Dad, Chloe had written. Bradley just got the final notice from the commercial lender. If we do not pay off the balance on his equipment trucks by Friday, they are coming to repossess everything. He is completely underwater. We cannot survive this. Please tell me you can help us. I read my father's printed reply. Do not panic, Chloe. Your mother and I will handle this. We are going to wire $30,000 to Bradley's business account on Monday morning. That should cover the trucks and give you enough left over to catch up on the house payments. I quickly flipped to the next printed page. It was Chloe's response sent just 2 hours later. Thank you so much, Dad. You are a lifesaver. But where are you getting that much cash so fast? I thought your retirement bonds were tied up until next year. I stared at the paper, my heart pounding so hard I could hear the rushing blood in my ears. Chloe had asked the exact same question I had asked my mother in the kitchen. She knew they did not have the liquid cash to just hand out $30,000. I turned the page to read my father's reply. We are not using the retirement bonds, Chloe. We are using the life insurance funds from Tom's payout. Claire is completely out of her mind with grief and has absolutely no idea how to handle that kind of wealth. I have primary custodial control of the account. It is family money now, and family helps family. Do not mention a word of this to your sister. She would only use it for frivolous things anyway. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Family money. He had taken the tragic, devastating death of my 36-year-old husband and immediately relabeled his life insurance policy as a communal family slush fund. He did not view it as Lily's future. He viewed it as his own personal bank account. But the absolute worst part was waiting for me on the final printed page. It was an email from Chloe sent the following Tuesday afternoon. Dad, did the wire from Tom's money clear yet? Bradley needs the truck paid off before the bank takes it tomorrow morning. Let me know when it hits the account. We are going out to dinner to celebrate tonight. Love you. I dropped the stack of papers onto the rug. I felt like I could not pull enough oxygen into my lungs. Chloe knew. Bradley knew. My mother knew. The entire family knew exactly where that money was coming from. They all sat around that dining room table on Sunday evenings, eating expensive roast beef and drinking fine wine, knowing perfectly well that they were chewing on the bones of my husband's legacy. Chloe had looked me right in the face and complained about her financial struggles, knowing that she had already begged my father to steal my daughter's inheritance to bail her out. They were all in on it. It was not just my father acting alone. It was a man-coordinated family conspiracy to strip a grieving widow and a fatherless 10-year-old girl of everything they had left in the world. They had watched me struggle to pay for Lily's dental crown. They had watched me pack my lunch every single day because I could not afford to buy a sandwich. They had watched me squeeze into a tiny twin bed in their cramped laundry room closet, and they had done absolutely nothing but judge me for not working harder. A profound, absolute silence settled over my mind. The shock was entirely gone. The grief was gone. The desperate, childlike desire to have a loving, supportive family evaporated into thin air, leaving nothing behind but pure, unadulterated tactical resolve. I picked up my cell phone. I checked the battery life and wiped the camera lens clean on the sleeve of my dress. I was not going to confront them. I was not going to cry and demand explanations. You do not ask thieves why they stole from you. You simply gather the evidence and you let the law annihilate them. I started with the forged bank receipts. I placed them flat on the cherry wood desk, ensuring the natural light from the window illuminated every single pen stroke of my father's perfect forgery. I took multiple photos of each receipt, zooming in on the fraudulent signatures and the bank approval stamps. I moved to the monthly statements next. I photographed every page that showed a massive outgoing wire transfer. I captured the ending balance of -$42. I made sure the dates and account numbers were perfectly in focus. Then I turned to the printed emails. I photographed Chloe asking for Tom's money. I photographed my father calling my husband's life insurance family money. I captured the undeniable written proof of their entire conspiracy. Every time my camera clicked, I felt another heavy chain fall off my shoulders. I was no longer the helpless, hysterical widow they had created in their minds. I was a professional auditor executing a flawless investigation. Once I had taken nearly 100 photos, I sat back down on the floor and began the meticulous process of putting the files back together. This was the most crucial part of the operation. If my father suspected even for a single second that I had seen these documents, he would shred the hard copies, move whatever assets he had left, and legally evict me before I could find a lawyer. I stacked the bank statements in their exact original chronological order. I slid the forged transfer receipts behind their corresponding monthly pages. I aligned the edges perfectly, ensuring there were no bent corners or wrinkled pages. I placed the stack of printed emails back under the heavy binder clip and tucked them into the very back of the folder. I slid the heavy green hanging folder back into the third drawer of the filing cabinet. I closed the drawer slowly, listening to the soft metallic click of the latch engaging. I looked around the home office, making sure the Persian rug was flat and the chair was in its proper place. I walked out into the hallway and pulled the heavy oak door shut. I picked up the industrial steel padlock and hooked it back through the metal latch. I pushed the heavy shackle down until it snapped securely into place, locking the absolute destruction of their lives safely away in the dark. I walked upstairs to the master bedroom, placed the brass key back inside the faded black velvet watchbox, and closed the mahogany dresser drawer. I smoothed out the pristine white bedspread where I had accidentally brushed against it. I left the room exactly as I had found it. When I walked back downstairs to the kitchen, the house was just as quiet as before. But everything had changed. The balance of power had completely shifted. I walked over to the guest room and gently knocked on the door. Lily opened it, holding her tablet, her big brown eyes looking up at me with quiet concern. "Are you done with your paperwork, Mommy?" she asked softly. I knelt down and pulled her into a fierce, tight hug. I breathed in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and closed my eyes. "Yes, sweetie," I whispered into her hair. "Mommy is all done. Everything is going to be perfectly fine now." I stood up and walked over to the kitchen sink, washing my hands with cold water. I looked out the window at the manicured suburban street, waiting for my parents' luxury sedan to pull back into the driveway. They were going to walk through that front door in their Sunday best, feeling righteous and incredibly wealthy. They were going to look down on me. They were going to patronize me, and I was going to smile back at them. The silent war had officially begun. I was going to play the obedient, grateful daughter for exactly as long as it took to build a legal trap they could never escape from. They had treated my tragedy as their personal lottery win. Now I was going to show them exactly what happens when the bill finally comes due. I woke up the next morning with a kind of cold, mechanical focus I had never experienced before. The terrifying realization that my own parents had robbed my grieving daughter blind had burned away every ounce of my remaining naivety. I made Lily her breakfast, a bowl of oatmeal with sliced bananas, and kissed her forehead as she boarded the yellow school bus. I watched the bus turn the corner, waving until it was out of sight. Then I drove my 10-year-old sedan to the logistics firm where I worked as a payroll specialist. Sitting at my cramped cubicle, surrounded by the hum of fluorescent lights and the clacking of keyboards, I felt like a completely different person. I was no longer the broken, hysterical widow my father desperately wanted me to be. I was a woman with a mission, and that mission was absolute, undeniable justice. At exactly 9 o'clock, I picked up my desk phone and called a number I had found during a late-night internet search. The receptionist for Davis & Associates answered on the second ring. I asked for an emergency consultation with Jonathan Davis. He was a senior litigator specializing in estate fraud and white-collar financial crimes. I had read his biography online. He was known in the city as a ruthless, brilliant attorney who systematically dismantled people who exploited the vulnerable. The receptionist told me he was booked for weeks. I took a deep breath, lowered my voice so my coworkers would not hear, and told her I had high-resolution photographic evidence of a $150,000 felony wire fraud committed by a custodial trustee, complete with forged bank documents. There was a brief pause on the line. She put me on hold for less than a minute. When she returned, she told me Jonathan Davis would see me at noon. I spent my entire morning silently preparing my case. As a payroll professional, I knew that lawyers, much like auditors, did not care about tears or emotional outbursts. They cared about timelines, verifiable facts, and indisputable paper trails. I organized the 50 photographs I had taken in my father's home office, placing them into a chronological digital presentation on my encrypted tablet. I matched every single forged withdrawal slip to the corresponding wire transfer and the eventual purchase. When the clock struck noon, I grabbed my coat and drove straight to the downtown business district. The law firm of Davis and Associates was located on the 30th floor of a sleek glass high-rise. The lobby was lined with dark walnut paneling and thick carpets that absorbed the sound of my footsteps. I was ushered immediately into a massive corner conference room. Jonathan Davis was a tall, sharply dressed man in his late 50s, with silver hair and calculating, intelligent eyes. He did not offer empty platitudes or fake sympathy about my husband's passing. He shook my hand firmly, sat down across from me at the long mahogany table, and asked me to show him exactly what I had found. I opened my tablet and pushed it across the polished wood. I started from the beginning. I showed him the initial life insurance deposit of $150,000 into the joint custodial account. Then I swiped to the first forged withdrawal slip. I explained how my father, Richard, had manipulated me into signing the initial trust documents under the guise of protecting Lily's college fund. I showed him the signature on the withdrawal slip, and then pulled out my own driver license and several of my own signed payroll documents. Look at the loop on the letter C, I told him, pointing at the screen. Look at the angle of the last letter. It is a perfect forgery. He practiced my handwriting to bypass the bank's dual signature mandate for withdrawals over $10,000. Jonathan zoomed in on the image, his eyes narrowing. He did not say a word. He just nodded for me to continue. I swiped to the next photograph. It was the $40,000 wire transfer. I matched it to the photograph of the crumpled invoice I had dug out of the kitchen trash can. I explained that my parents had locked their basement claiming foundation issues while secretly paying a high-end audiovisual contractor to build a luxury home theater system complete with tiered leather recliners and a massive projection screen. I swiped to the next image showing the $30,000 transfer sent directly to my brother-in-law Bradley's failing contracting business. I brought up the printed email exchange I had found in the filing cabinet, the one where my younger sister Chloe explicitly asked if the wire from Tom's life insurance money had cleared yet. I showed Jonathan the email where my father referred to my dead husband's legacy as family money, bragging about how I was too overwhelmed with grief to ever notice it was missing. Finally, I showed him the last bank statement, the one revealing the negative $42 balance resulting from an overdraft fee. I sat back in my chair and folded my hands on the table. My voice did not shake once during the entire 20-minute presentation. Jonathan Davis took off his reading glasses and set them down on the mahogany table. He looked at me for a long, heavy moment. The silence in the conference room was thick with gravity. "Claire," he said, his voice completely devoid of the usual detached, lawyerly tone. "In my 30 years of practicing law, I have seen families tear each other apart over money. I have seen siblings fight over estates and children manipulate their elderly parents. But the level of calculated malicious predation required to steal a life insurance payout from a grieving 10-year-old child while forcing her mother to live in a laundry room closet is one of the most disgusting things I have ever seen." Hearing him say those words out loud broke something open inside my chest. For 10 months, my parents had gaslighted me. They had convinced me I was crazy, hysterical, and ungrateful. They made me feel like a terrible mother who was incapable of surviving without their benevolent charity. Having a brilliant legal mind validate my reality, having him confirm that I was not crazy, and that my parents were actually monsters, was the most profoundly liberating moment of my life. "This is not just a civil dispute over mismanaged trust funds," Jonathan continued, pulling a legal pad toward him. "Your father did not just breach his fiduciary duty as a custodian. By forging your signature on those withdrawal slips to bypass the bank's security measures, he committed felony forgery. By moving funds across state lines to pay that audiovisual contractor and your brother-in-law, he committed felony wire fraud. And by draining $150,000 from a minor's designated trust, he committed grand larceny. Your father is looking at serious federal prison time, and your mother and sister, based on these emails, are legally complicit as accessories after the fact." I took a slow, deep breath. The word prison hung in the air between us. A small, conditioned part of me, the part that had been raised to always keep the peace and protect the family, Image flinched. But then I thought about my daughter Lily squeezing into that tiny twin bed every night, crying for her father, while her grandparents drank imported wine in the next room. The hesitation instantly vanished. "What do we do?" I asked him. "Do I call the police tonight? Do I confront him when I get home?" "Absolutely not," Jonathan said sharply, leaning forward. "You do not say a single word to them. Confrontation is the absolute worst thing you could do right now. Your father is an arrogant man, but he is not an idiot. If you go home and scream at him, if you tell him you know about the forged signatures and the empty account, you will give him exactly what he needs. You will give him time." I frowned, not fully understanding. "Time for what?" "Time to hide his assets," Jonathan explained. "If he knows you're coming for him, he will immediately empty his own personal checking accounts. He will transfer his retirement funds into offshore holdings or obscure trusts. He will file for emergency bankruptcy to protect the equity in his house. He might even destroy the physical evidence in that filing cabinet before we can get a legal subpoena to secure it. And most importantly, he will legally evict you and Lily from his house tomorrow morning, leaving you homeless while you try to fight a prolonged legal battle. We are not going to confront them, Claire. We are going to ambush them." Jonathan stood up and walked over to a whiteboard on the wall, uncapping a black marker. He began to map out a strategy that was so ruthless and mathematically perfect, it made my payroll brain sing with satisfaction. "First," Jonathan said, writing rapidly on the board, "we are going to file an ex parte motion for a temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction. Because we have photographic proof of active, ongoing felony fraud, I can get a judge to sign an emergency asset freeze by next week. We are going to completely lock down every single financial account tied to Richard and Barbara's names. Their checking accounts, their savings, their retirement portfolios, and their credit cards will be frozen solid. They will not be able to buy a cup of coffee, let alone hire a defense attorney to fight you." I watched him draw a hard line under the word freeze. My heart was pounding with pure adrenaline. "Second," he continued, "we are going to go after the physical assets they purchased with your daughter's stolen money. I am going to initiate the process for a constructive trust and file mechanical liens against the property. That custom home theater they built in the basement is legally the property of Lily's trust because it was funded directly by stolen trust assets. The same goes for this brand new luxury SUV sitting in your sister's driveway. We are going to secure court orders to repossess the theater equipment and the vehicle to immediately recover liquid value for the estate." "You are telling me we can legally take the theater out of their house?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan turned around and smiled. A sharp, predatory smile. "I am telling you we can take the leather seats, the projection screen, the acoustic paneling, and the espresso machine on their kitchen counter. We are going to strip them down to the bare walls. But for this to work flawlessly, you have to be the best actress in the world for the next 3 weeks. You have to go back to that house and pretend you are still the broken, submissive, grateful daughter. You have to let them continue to belittle you. You have to endure their family dinners. You cannot let the mask slip for even 1 second. Can you do that?" I thought about the unbearable smugness on my mother's face when she showed off her designer handbags. I thought about my father threatening to throw us out into the rain. I looked Jonathan Davis dead in the eye and nodded. "I can do it. I have been invisible my whole life. They will not suspect a thing." Jonathan sat back down and began pulling drafting paper from his desk drawer. "Good. We will prepare the filings quietly. In the meantime, I need you to secretly find a safe place for you and Lily to live. Rent an apartment, pack your bags in the middle of the night if you have to, and get ready to disappear. Once you are safe, we execute the freeze, we drop the hammer, and we let the police handle the rest." I walked out of the Columbia Center that afternoon and stepped onto the busy Seattle sidewalk. The rain had stopped, and the gray clouds were finally beginning to break apart. I had walked into that building as a terrified victim, carrying the weight of a stolen future. I walked out as a woman holding a loaded legal weapon, ready to burn my parents' perfect, fraudulent world to the ground. The trap was set. All I had to do now was smile and wait. Walking back into my parents' house that evening was the hardest performance of my entire life. I pulled my 10-year-old sedan into the driveway right next to my father's pristine luxury car. I sat behind the steering wheel for a long time, practicing my breathing. I had to completely bury the fierce, protective mother who had just plotted federal charges with a high-powered attorney. I had to resurrect the timid, broken widow my parents expected to see. When I unlocked the front door, the heavy scent of my mother's expensive pot roast hit me. She was standing in the kitchen wearing a fresh silk blouse, humming a church hymn. My father was sitting in his leather recliner, watching financial news on the television. I walked in, forced my shoulders to slump, and offered a weak, exhausted greeting. My father barely looked away from the screen, just muttering that dinner was almost ready and I needed to set the table. I nodded obediently. I walked into the dining room and grabbed the heavy silverware. Every time I placed a fork next to a porcelain plate, I reminded myself that the trap was set. The legal machinery was already moving. I just had to survive the next 21 days. The psychological warfare over the next 3 weeks was absolutely agonizing. Living with the people who had stolen my dead husband's legacy required a level of emotional detachment I never knew I possessed. The absolute worst part was the mandatory Sunday dinners. Chloe and Bradley came over every single weekend, proudly parking their $80,000 luxury SUV right in the center of the driveway. They treated my parents' home like their own personal country club. During the first Sunday dinner, after my meeting with Jonathan Davis, my father decided to hold court at the head of the table. He poured glasses of an incredibly expensive red wine, swirling it around and smelling it before taking a sip. He looked around the dining room with profound satisfaction. "You know," he said loudly, carving the roast beef, "a lot of men my age are struggling with inflation. They do not know how to manage their assets. But true financial acumen is about knowing when to make aggressive moves. You have to be ruthless to secure your family's future. I am just grateful I have the foresight to protect our wealth." Chloe clapped her hands together, her diamond rings catching the chandelier light. "Oh, absolutely, Dad," she gushed. "Bradley and I are just so inspired by you. Ever since you helped us restructure our business debt, everything has been amazing. We are even looking at booking a summer trip to the Bahamas. We just needed that little push to get over the hump." Bradley nodded eagerly, his mouth full of food. "Yeah, Richard, your business instincts saved us. We are finally breathing easy." I sat at the very end of the table, cutting Lily's meat into small pieces. My hands gripped the knife and fork so tightly my knuckles were completely white. I wanted to stand up and scream at them. I wanted to grab my father by his expensive silk collar and tell him he did not have financial acumen. I wanted to tell him he was a common thief who forged his grieving daughter's signature to steal $150,000 from a 10-year-old child. I wanted to look at Chloe and tell her that her Bahamas vacation was being funded by the life insurance policy of a dead man. But I looked down at my plate, forced my facial muscles to relax, and took a slow sip of ice water. "That is wonderful news, Chloe," I said softly, my voice dripping with fake sincerity. "I am so glad things are working out for you guys." My mother smiled at me, a tight, patronizing smile. "See, Claire," she said, "the Lord provides when you have a strong head of the household to guide the way. You just need to trust your father's vision." I nodded silently, focusing entirely on my daughter. Lily asked my father if he could pass the mashed potatoes. He ignored her completely until my mother nudged him. They treated my child like an invisible nuisance in their grand wealthy kingdom. They had stolen her college tuition, and they could not even be bothered to pass her a bowl of food. That cold indifference fueled my resolve every single day. While I was playing the submissive victim in the dining room, I was executing a flawless escape plan in the shadows. I knew that the moment Jonathan Davis dropped the legal hammer and froze my parents' bank accounts, this house would turn into a war zone. I could not let Lily be anywhere near that explosion. I needed a completely secure sanctuary. Thankfully, my logistics firm had just issued our annual performance bonuses. Because I had worked massive amounts of overtime trying to afford basic groceries, my bonus check was substantial. I did not deposit it into my regular checking account, knowing my parents might somehow demand to see my balances. Instead, I opened a brand new account at a completely different bank on the other side of town. I used that bonus money to sign a lease on a small, quiet, 2-bedroom apartment in a highly secure building just 10 minutes from Lily's elementary school. It was not fancy. It had basic carpets and standard appliances. But it was clean, it was safe, and it was entirely mine. The property manager handed me the keys on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I stood in the empty living room and cried tears of profound relief. The real challenge was moving our belongings out of my parents' house without triggering any suspicion. I had to do it completely invisibly, box by box, over the course of 2 weeks. I started buying heavy-duty black trash bags and plain cardboard boxes. Every evening after my parents retreated to their master suite to watch television, I would quietly go into the cramped guest room. I told Lily we were doing a fun secret mission. I had her pick out her most important books, her favorite clothes, and the special framed photographs of her father. I packed them carefully into the bottom of the black trash bags, layering old sweaters and cheap blankets on top to make it look like a donation pile. The next morning I would carry the bags right out the front door under my mother's watchful eye. "What on earth are you doing with all that trash, Claire?" my mother demanded one morning, sipping her coffee from her designer mug. "You are making the hallway look like a junkyard." I lowered my head and offered my best apologetic tone. "I am so sorry, Mom," I said meekly. "I am just doing some deep cleaning. I realized Lily and I have too many old clothes taking up space in your nice guest room. I am taking them to the charity donation bin on my way to work. I just want to keep things tidy for you." My mother huffed and waved her hand dismissively. "Well, make sure you do not drag dirt on the hardwood floors," she snapped. I smiled, told her I would be careful, and loaded my dead husband's legacy into the trunk of my 10-year-old sedan. Day by day, our tiny closet of a room grew emptier. I moved my work documents. I moved Lily's winter coats. I moved the few pieces of jewelry Tom had given me. I drove them straight to the new apartment on my lunch breaks, slowly building our safe haven, while my parents sat in their basement watching movies on their stolen 100-inch projection screen. The sheer psychological thrill of knowing I was completely outsmarting them kept me going through the exhaustion. They thought they had me trapped under their thumb. They had absolutely no idea I was already gone. The final, most terrifying test of my acting abilities came just 5 days before Jonathan Davis was scheduled to execute the emergency asset freeze. I was sitting at the kitchen table paying my auto insurance bill on my laptop when my father marched into the room. He slammed a thick stack of utility bills onto the granite island. He was scowling, his face red with irritation. My mother scurried in right behind him, wringing her hands in that fake, helpless way she always did when my father was putting on a show of financial dominance. "Claire," my father barked, pointing a thick finger at the stack of envelopes. "Your mother and I have been reviewing the household budget. The cost of groceries and utilities has gone up significantly since you and Lily moved in. We are providing you with a premium living environment, and quite frankly, your lack of contribution is becoming unacceptable. We are not running a free hotel." I kept my hands resting calmly on my laptop keyboard. I knew exactly what this was. My father had drained $150,000 from Lily's trust. He had given away $30,000 to Chloe. He had spent $40,000 on his home theater. He was burning through cash at an astonishing rate, and he was likely starting to feel the squeeze in his own personal checking accounts. He needed more liquid cash to maintain his wealthy country club facade, and he looked at me, his grieving, vulnerable daughter, as an open wallet. "I understand, Dad," I said softly, looking up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "I know it has been a burden having us here. I am so grateful for your charity. What do you need me to do?" My father crossed his arms over his chest, his eyes gleaming with greedy satisfaction. "Tax season just wrapped up," he stated firmly. "I know you filed your returns last month. Because you are claiming head of household and a dependent, your tax refund should be substantial this year. I expect you to endorse your entire tax refund check over to me by the end of the week. It will cover your back rent and the food you have been consuming. Consider it your contribution to the family that saved you from ruin." My heart stopped. My tax refund was exactly $4,000. I needed that money to buy furniture for the new apartment. I needed it to buy Lily a new bed. If I handed it over to him, I would have absolutely nothing left to start our new life. But if I refused, he would explode. He would demand to know why I was defying him. He might check the locked filing cabinet to make sure I had not discovered his crimes. I could not risk blowing the entire legal ambush for $4,000. I had to buy time. I had to give him exactly what he wanted, but completely on my own terms. "You are absolutely right, Dad," I said, keeping my voice incredibly steady and filled with submissive respect. "You and Mom have done so much for us. I actually did not get a paper check this year. The tax refund was direct deposited into my checking account yesterday. I can write you a personal check right now to cover the household expenses. Will $4,000 be enough to help with the groceries?" My mother let out a small, greedy gasp of delight. "Oh, Claire, that is so responsible of you," she cooed, completely dropping her helpless act. "That will definitely help your father balance the accounts. We just want to teach you how to be financially independent." My father nodded slowly, a smug, victorious smirk spreading across his face. "Write the check," he commanded. I opened my purse, pulled out my checkbook, and clicked my pen. I stared down at the blank slip of paper. My checking account, the one tied to this specific checkbook, currently had a balance of exactly $87. My performance bonus and my tax refund were safely locked away in the brand new secret account across town. I was about to deliberately write my father a fraudulent check for $4,000. I knew that when he took it to the bank, it would bounce immediately. It would trigger an insufficient funds alert. It would take the bank at least 3 to 4 business days to process the transaction, realize the check was bad, and notify my father. By the time he found out I had handed him a worthless piece of paper, the emergency asset freeze would already be active. His accounts would be locked. The trap would be sprung. I smiled warmly, signed my name with a flourish, and tore the check from the booklet. I stood up and handed it directly to my father. "Thank you for teaching me how to be responsible, Dad," I said, looking him dead in the eyes. "I really appreciate all your financial management." My father snatched the check from my hand, inspecting the numbers closely. He folded it neatly and slipped it into his expensive suit pocket. "See, Barbara," he said, turning to my mother. "This is what happens when you enforce strict discipline. The girl is finally learning how the real world works." He looked back at me, his expression full of arrogant pride. "You did the right thing, Claire. Keep this up, and maybe one day you will actually be able to stand on your own 2 feet. They walked out of the kitchen completely satisfied, utterly convinced of their own brilliant superiority. I stood alone by the granite island, listening to their footsteps fade down the hallway. I did not feel fear. I did not feel intimidation. I felt the absolute undeniable power of a woman who was holding the match, while her enemies stood happily soaked in gasoline. They thought they had bullied me into submission. They thought they had extracted my last remaining dollar. They had absolutely no idea that the piece of paper in his pocket was a ticking time bomb. The next 4 days moved at an agonizingly slow pace. I finalized the move into the secret apartment. I moved the last of Lily's toys and my work clothes in small, unnoticeable batches. I bought a cheap mattress for Lily to sleep on, and a small table for us to eat at. Our room in my parents' house was essentially empty, save for a few staging props I left out to maintain the illusion: a pair of old shoes in the closet, a broken hairbrush on the bathroom counter, a stack of meaningless mail on the nightstand. If my mother had bothered to look closely, she would have realized we were already gone. But my mother never looked closely at anything that did not directly benefit her own ego. On Thursday afternoon, I received a secure email from attorney Jonathan Davis. The subject line was incredibly brief. It simply read, "Motion granted." I opened the message and read the details. The judge had reviewed my high-resolution photographs of the forged bank withdrawal slips, the home theater invoices, and the wire transfers to Bradley's business. The judge had seen the printed emails proving my father was treating a grieving child's life insurance policy as a personal family slush fund. The evidence was so overwhelming, so maliciously blatant, that the judge had signed the emergency ex parte order without a single moment of hesitation. The asset freeze was scheduled to hit the banking systems at exactly 9 o'clock on Sunday morning. Every penny my parents had to their names was about to be locked in a legal vault. The mechanical lien on the home theater equipment and the luxury SUV had been finalized. The repossession agents and the local police department were completely briefed and ready to execute the recovery orders. The timing could not possibly have been more perfectly aligned. This upcoming Sunday was the Super Bowl. My parents had been bragging for weeks about the massive premiere party they were hosting in their newly renovated basement. They had invited over 40 people: wealthy neighbors, prominent members of their church congregation, local business owners, and of course Chloe and Bradley. They were planning to serve expensive catered food and show off their stolen $40,000 home theater system to their entire social circle. They wanted an audience to witness their grand, luxurious lifestyle. They wanted everyone to see how successful and generous the Miller family truly was. Though they were going to get exactly what they wanted. They were going to get an audience. But the show they were about to put on was going to be a devastating, inescapable public execution. Friday night, I tucked Lily into her new bed in our safe, quiet apartment. She smiled, happy to finally have her own space away from the suffocating tension of her grandparents' house. I sat on the floor next to her, holding her hand until she fell asleep. I thought about my late husband, Tom. I thought about how hard he had worked to leave her that money, to make sure she would never have to suffer. I had let my parents manipulate my grief. I had let them take control because I was too weak to fight them. But I was not weak anymore. Saturday passed in a blur of quiet anticipation. I drove back to my parents' house for the final time. I helped my mother chop vegetables for the caterers. I polished the glass coffee tables. I watched my father test the booming surround sound system in the basement, loudly proclaiming that the bass was worth every single penny. I nodded and smiled, playing the obedient servant one last time. I went to sleep in this cramped laundry room closet, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise. The 3 weeks of agonizing psychological warfare were finally over. The trap was fully armed, the bait was taken, and tomorrow the heavy steel jaws were going to snap shut forever. The morning of the Super Bowl arrived with a crisp and freezing winter chill that seeped through the thin walls of the laundry room closet. I woke up on the cramped twin bed for the very last time. I lay there in the dark for a long, quiet moment, just listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of my 10-year-old daughter, Lily, sleeping safely beside me. Today was the day. The 21 days of agonizing psychological warfare had finally reached their absolute climax. I carefully slipped out from under the thin blanket, making sure not to disturb her peaceful rest. I dressed in complete silence, putting on a plain black sweater and dark slacks, which was the perfect invisible uniform for the obedient servant my parents expected me to be. I walked into the massive kitchen, and the sheer scale of my parents' arrogance was already on full staggering display. It was only 8 in the morning, but a massive commercial catering van was already parked aggressively in the center of the driveway. My mother, Barbara, was wearing a pristine white velour tracksuit and barking sharp orders at 2 terrified catering assistants who were struggling to carry heavy silver chafing dishes through the front double doors. She turned and saw me standing quietly near the coffee maker. She immediately scowled and told me to make myself useful by polishing the crystal champagne flutes in the formal dining room before the guests began to arrive. I nodded meekly, keeping my eyes cast firmly downward, and whispered that I would get to work right away. My father, Richard, emerged from his luxury master suite a few hours later. He was dressed in expensive casual wear, sporting a designer polo shirt and imported leather loafers. He looked exactly like a man who believed he owned the entire world and everyone in it. He poured himself a cup of dark roast coffee and loudly announced to the kitchen that today was going to be the greatest day in the history of their wealthy suburban neighborhood. He proclaimed that he was finally going to unveil his absolute masterpiece to all of his important friends. He walked down the long carpeted hallway and proudly unlocked the heavy industrial steel padlock on the basement door. This was the exact same basement he had padlocked months ago, claiming it was a toxic mold hazard to keep me away from his massive financial secret. I spent the next 4 hours washing delicate porcelain dishes, arranging imported cheese platters, and wiping down the expansive granite countertops. The catered spread they had ordered was sickeningly lavish and obscenely expensive. There were massive crystal platters of jumbo shrimp cocktail prime rib sliders, delicate artisan flatbreads, and multiple heavy wooden crates of imported French champagne. Every single shrimp and every single drop of alcohol in that kitchen was paid for by the blood and sweat of my dead husband. They were throwing a massive, extravagant party using the stolen life insurance money meant specifically to protect his grieving daughter from poverty. My stomach violently churned with pure, absolute disgust, but I forced my facial muscles into a perfectly blank, submissive mask. I was a senior payroll specialist. I knew exactly how to stick to a rigid timeline. I just had to wait for the final pieces of my trap to fall into place. By 3 in the afternoon, the VIP guests began to arrive. The wide street in front of my parents' massive brick house quickly filled with a parade of luxury vehicles. The wealthy neighbors from the gated community strolled up the manicured driveway, wearing designer coats. The highly judgmental women from my mother church group walked through the front door in their Sunday best, loudly praising the beautiful and expensive, custom floral arrangements my mother had ordered for the foyer. And then, right on perfect cue, my sister Chloe and her husband Bradley pulled up in the brand new $80,000 luxury SUV they had purchased with Lily, stolen trust fund money. Chloe strutted into the grand entryway wearing a highly expensive silk blouse and flashing her diamond rings for everyone to see. She hugged my mother tightly, shrieking with exaggerated excitement about the big premiere party. Bradley shook my father's hand, slapping him hard on the back and loudly calling him the smartest financial mind in the entire state. They stood together in the grand foyer, forming a tight circle of thieves, cheerfully congratulating each other on their absolute brilliance. I stood completely still near the kitchen island, holding a heavy tray of crystal water glasses, while remaining completely invisible to them. Chloe finally noticed me standing in the shadows and offered a tight, patronizing smile. She told me I looked very tired and casually suggested I try putting on some makeup so I would not accidentally bring down the festive mood of their luxury party. I simply smiled back at her, thanked her for the kind advice, and offered her a fresh glass of stolen champagne. As the official kickoff time for the Super Bowl rapidly approached, my father clapped his hands together and loudly announced to the foyer that it was time for the grand unveiling. He directed the massive crowd of 40 wealthy people toward the basement staircase. The guests murmured with intense excitement, carrying their expensive drinks and catered appetizer plates down the thickly carpeted steps. My mother turned to me and sharply instructed me to follow them down with a fresh tray of hot prime rib sliders, strictly reminding me to stay out of the way of the important guests. I walked slowly down the stairs and stepped into the newly renovated space. The sheer scale of the financial theft was breathtaking to witness in person. The dank, unfinished concrete basement I remembered clearly from my childhood was completely gone. In its place was a commercial-grade luxury movie theater that belonged in a Hollywood mansion. The walls were fully lined with premium acoustic paneling wrapped in dark acoustic velvet. The floors were completely covered in thick, plush luxury carpeting that absorbed every sound. In the exact center of the room, a custom-built wooden platform held 2 sweeping rows of massive, heated leather reclining theater seats. Each premium seat had built-in custom cup holders and illuminated digital control panels. And dominating the entire front wall of the basement was the 100-inch ambient light rejecting projection screen displaying the pre-game football show in flawless, blinding high-definition color. The wealthy guests gasped in genuine awe. The church ladies covered their mouths, completely astounded by the sheer excessive luxury of the room. The rich neighbors nodded their heads in deep, profound respect. Bradley let out a loud, obnoxious whistle, dropping his weight into one of the front-row leather recliners, and loudly declaring it the most comfortable chair he had ever sat in his entire life. My father stood proudly at the front of the room, basking in the absolute, unchecked adoration of his peers. He held up his hands, asking the crowd for quiet. The room immediately settled down, and he delivered a speech that made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. He looked slowly around the luxury room, making direct, meaningful eye contact with his business associates and his church friends. He confidently told them that building a lasting family legacy requires deep sacrifice, intense intelligence, and a ruthless dedication to financial stewardship. He proudly claimed that he and Barbara had worked incredibly hard their entire lives to secure a prosperous and wealthy future for their family. He swept his hand toward the massive screen and stated that this beautiful theater was a direct testament to the rewards of smart, aggressive investments. He actually had the sheer, unmitigated audacity to look directly at the senior pastor of his church and say that the Lord truly blesses those who know how to multiply their talents. I stood quietly in the dark shadows near the back wall, holding my heavy silver tray of prime rib sliders. I looked at the massive, high-definition laser projector mounted to the ceiling. I looked at the heated, leather reclining seats. I looked at the custom acoustic velvet wall panels. I knew the exact dollar amount of every single item in this room because I had photographed the $40,000 invoice shoved deeply into the bottom of the kitchen trash can. I knew that every single word coming out of my father's mouth was a vile, disgusting, and sociopathic lie. He was not a brilliant financial genius. He was a common predatory criminal who had meticulously forged his grieving daughter's signature to steal $150,000 from a traumatized 10-year-old child. The wealthy crowd erupted into loud, enthusiastic applause. My mother proudly kissed his cheek. Chloe raised her crystal champagne glass high in the air and proposed a joyful toast to the greatest and most generous parents in the entire world. I did not scream at them. I did not drop my heavy silver tray. I did not shed a single tear. I simply waited in the dark. The Super Bowl officially kicked off on the massive screen. The premium surround sound system roared to vibrant life, violently shaking the very foundation of the brick house. The heavy bass from the hidden speakers was incredibly loud, completely masking any possible noise from the upper levels of the home. The guests were instantly and totally captivated by the giant screen shouting and cheering loudly as the football game finally began. My father sank deeply into his center leather recliner, his eyes locked entirely on the brilliant high-definition display. My mother was busy handing out extra linen napkins to the wealthy women sitting in the second row. Chloe and Bradley were laughing loudly at a television commercial. No one was looking at me. No one ever looked at me. I set the heavy silver catering tray down gently on a small wooden side table near the staircase. I did not make a single sound. I turned my back on the $40,000 stolen luxury theater, walked silently up the carpeted stairs, and stepped back into the quiet, empty kitchen. I walked quickly and purposefully down the long hallway to the laundry room closet. I opened the door. Lily was sitting patiently on the edge of the bare twin bed, wearing her warm winter coat with her small purple backpack strapped tightly to her shoulders. She looked up at me with her big, beautiful brown eyes, waiting for my final signal. I smiled at her with a real, genuine smile and held out my hand. "It is time to go, sweetie," I whispered softly. "Our secret mission is finally ready." She took my hand tightly in hers. We walked out of the cramped guest room for the absolute last time. I did not look back at the grand, wealthy foyer. I did not look back at the pristine granite kitchen or the expensive mahogany dining table. I pulled my car keys from my coat pocket. We walked out the back door of the massive house, stepping out into the cool, crisp winter evening. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long, peaceful shadows across the perfectly manicured suburban lawns. I unlocked my beat-up 10-year-old sedan. Lily climbed quickly into the back seat and securely buckled her seatbelt. I slid into the driver's seat, put the key in the ignition, and started the engine. The old car hummed to life. I put the gear shift in reverse, backed smoothly out of the wide driveway, and drove away from the massive brick house. As I turned the corner, leaving the wealthy gated neighborhood completely behind me, I felt a massive physical weight lift entirely off my chest. The suffocating terror that had completely defined my life for the last 10 agonizing months evaporated instantly into the cool night air. The drive to our completely secret new apartment took exactly 10 minutes. The suburban streets were completely empty and silent because everyone in the city was inside watching the big football game. I pulled into the secure parking lot of our new building, turned off the car engine, and took a deep, shuddering breath of true freedom. We were safe. We were completely and entirely out of their toxic reach. We walked together up the outdoor stairs to the second floor, and I unlocked the door to our small, quiet apartment. It was not a sprawling mansion. It did not have expensive fine art or imported crystal chandeliers, but it had a warm, comfortable bed for my daughter, a clean, functional kitchen, and absolute, undeniable peace. Lily took off her purple backpack and ran happily into her very own bedroom, looking at the small stack of books and toys we had carefully smuggled out over the past 2 weeks. I walked slowly into the center of the small living room and stood by the glass window looking out at the glowing city lights. I reached deep into my dark coat pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked the digital screen and immediately opened my messaging application. I selected the secure, encrypted contact number for Jonathan Davis, the ruthless estate and fraud attorney, who was currently holding the match to my parents' fraudulent financial empire. My hands were perfectly still. I did not feel a single ounce of hesitation, guilt, or remorse. My parents had proudly made their choices. They had viewed my deep personal tragedy as their own private lottery win. They had maliciously stolen my child future for heated leather chairs and fancy champagne toasts. I stared at the blank text message box, my thumb hovering steadily over the digital keyboard. I typed exactly one word: execute. I pressed send. I sent the text message to attorney Jonathan Davis from the safety of my new apartment living room. But the moment my thumb pressed the send button, my heart began to pound, with an overwhelming, undeniable need for absolute closure. I had spent 10 agonizing months living as a complete ghost in my own life, bullied, degraded, and manipulated by the very people who had maliciously stolen my dead husband's money. I could not simply sit in my small, quiet kitchen and imagine their glorious downfall. I had to witness it with my own 2 eyes. I walked into the bedroom and told my sweet daughter Lily to keep her headphones on and keep watching her movie, because Mommy would be right back. I locked the apartment door tightly behind me, ran quickly down the stairs, and got back into the driver's seat of my beat-up 10-year-old sedan. I drove straight back toward the wealthy gated community where my parents lived. I did not pull into their wide driveway or park anywhere near their property. Instead, I parked my car 2 blocks away, sliding into the deep, heavy shadows of a large oak tree right where the residential street curved. I rolled down my driver's side window, letting the freezing winter air wash over my hot face, and I waited in the absolute silence. It did not take long for the trap to spring shut. Jonathan Davis was a man who delivered exactly what he promised with ruthless surgical precision. Exactly 12 minutes after I sent the execution text, the quiet, pristine peace of the wealthy suburban neighborhood was violently and permanently shattered. I watched in absolute awe as a massive fleet of heavy vehicles turned onto the main avenue, moving together like a highly coordinated military convoy. There were 3 dark blue police cruisers, with their red and blue emergency lights silently flashing, painting the manicured lawns and the expensive brick houses in harsh rotating colors. Right behind the police cruisers was a massive heavy-duty flatbed tow truck, roaring its loud diesel engine into the quiet Sunday afternoon. Following the tow truck were 2 large white commercial moving vans driven by the bonded repossession agents Jonathan had specially hired for this exact operation. They rolled down the pristine street and parked in a perfectly coordinated blockade right in front of my parents' massive brick house. I stepped out of my car and walked quietly down the sidewalk, staying completely hidden behind the tall, decorative privacy hedges that lined the neighborhood properties. I wanted a front-row seat to the absolute destruction of their fraudulent empire. The police officers stepped out of their cruisers, adjusting their heavy utility belts and their dark uniforms. The repossession agents jumped out of the massive white vans holding thick legal clipboards and heavy steel power tools. They marched aggressively up the long paved driveway, completely ignoring my mother's precious custom landscaping and her expensive decorative garden stones. They did not knock politely on the door. One of the senior police officers pounded his heavy fist against the grand double front doors with incredible force. The sound echoed down the quiet suburban street, loud and terrifyingly demanding. Inside the house, I knew the Super Bowl halftime show was currently playing on their stolen 100-inch projection screen. They probably could not hear the knocking over the booming bass of the stolen luxury surround sound system. The officer pounded again, much harder this time, leaning close to the heavy wood and demanding that Richard Miller open the door immediately. The heavy oak door finally swung open. My father stood in the grand entryway holding a crystal glass of expensive red wine, looking incredibly annoyed that someone had dared to interrupt his luxury premiere party. I could see the immediate terrifying shift in his arrogant posture when he realized he was not looking at a late-arriving party guest or a lost delivery driver. He was looking at 3 uniformed police officers and a team of tough men in heavy work boots. The senior officer did not lower his voice to protect my father's precious community reputation. He spoke loudly and clearly, stating that they were executing an emergency ex parte court order. He announced directly into my father's face that all of Richard and Barbara Miller's personal financial assets had been completely frozen by a federal judge. He stated that they were conducting an active criminal investigation into felony, wire fraud, felony forgery, and grand larceny involving the malicious theft of $150,000 from a minor's custodial trust account. The brutal words echoed clearly through the grand foyer, carrying perfectly into the main living room. I watched from the dark shadows of the hedges as my father's smug face drained of all color, turning a sickly, terrifying shade of pale gray. His jaw dropped open in absolute shock, and his crystal wine glass slipped directly from his trembling fingers, shattering violently against the expensive hardwood floor, just like my mother's coffee cup had done days earlier. The loud commotion at the front door had successfully drawn an audience. The wealthy country club neighbors, the highly judgmental church ladies, and the prominent business associates began spilling out of the basement staircase and gathering closely in the foyer. They stood clutching their hot appetizer plates and their crystal champagne flutes, staring in absolute horror as the police officers read the brutal, irrefutable facts of my father's financial crimes out loud for everyone to hear. The officer explicitly detailed how the life insurance policy of a deceased father had been systematically and ruthlessly drained through perfectly forged bank withdrawal documents. My mother, Barbara, aggressively pushed her way through the thick crowd of stunned wealthy guests. She was wearing her pristine white velour tracksuit, her face twisted into a terrifying mask of frantic, aggressive denial. She shrieked loudly at the police officers, demanding they leave her property immediately, screaming that this was all a massive, terrible misunderstanding created by her hysterical, mentally unstable daughter. The senior police officer simply stared at her and handed her a thick, heavy stack of legal documents, including the high-resolution color photographs I had taken of the forged withdrawal slips and the undeniable wire transfer receipts. He told her in a cold, flat tone that she was legally barred from interfering with the court, ordered mechanical lien, and that any attempt to stop the bonded repossession agents from doing their job would result in her immediate physical arrest for obstruction of justice. My mother stared down at the crisp photographs of her own husband's fraudulent signatures. The magnificent illusion of her perfect, wealthy Christian life shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of the senior pastor and her entire congregation. The repossession agents did not wait for my parents to emotionally process the shock of their ruined lives. The team leader waved his calloused hand, and 5 burly men carrying heavy-duty commercial dollies and thick moving blankets marched straight past my paralyzed parents. They walked directly through the grand foyer, forcefully parting the sea of terrified wealthy guests, and headed straight down the thickly carpeted stairs into the basement. I crept slightly closer to the edge of the property, my heart soaring with a cold, profound, and absolute satisfaction. I could hear the muffled shouts of the agents as they entered the luxury home theater. They did not care that the Super Bowl halftime show was playing. They simply reached up and yanked the heavy power cords right out of the electrical walls, plunging the massive luxury screen into total, complete darkness. Within mere minutes, the absolute public dismantling of my parents' stolen kingdom officially began. The heavy front double doors were propped wide open to the freezing winter air. The repossession agents emerged from the basement carrying the massive custom-built heated leather reclining theater seats one by one. They hauled them aggressively up the stairs and marched them right past the horrified, gasping church ladies, carrying them out the front door and loading them roughly into the back of the white commercial moving vans. My father stood completely frozen in the entryway, leaning heavily against the decorative wall like his legs could no longer physically support his own weight. He watched helplessly as the physical manifestations of his stolen wealth were stripped away piece by painful piece. The agents carried out the high-definition laser projector, the custom acoustic velvet wall panels, and the expensive surround sound speakers. They literally unbolted the massive 100-inch projection screen from the basement drywall, rolled it up like a cheap, dirty rug, and carried it out the front door, right past his stunned, wealthy business associates. The party guests quickly realized exactly what was happening in front of them. They realized that the lavish, catered food they were eating, the expensive French champagne they were drinking, and the luxury theater they had just been sitting in were paid for directly by a stolen child's trust fund. The disgust and absolute revulsion on their faces was entirely undeniable. Pastor Miller walked out the front door shaking his head in profound disgusted disappointment, refusing to even look at my father as he passed him on the front porch. The wealthy neighbors began power walking down the driveway, desperate to physically distance themselves from the catastrophic public humiliation. They hurried into their luxury vehicles and sped away down the street, completely abandoning my parents to their total, absolute ruin. My mother sank slowly to her knees on the foyer floor, sobbing hysterically. Not out of remorse for what she had done to a grieving 10-year-old girl, but out of pure, unadulterated narcissistic shame that her entire social circle now knew she was a common, pathetic thief. But the cinematic legal justice of the afternoon was not quite finished yet. As the guests frantically fled the property, a loud, piercing scream echoed across the front manicured lawn. My sister Chloe came running out the front door, completely ignoring the massive repossession operation happening right in the foyer. She sprinted wildly down the driveway, waving her arms frantically and shrieking at the absolute top of her lungs. The heavy, flatbed tow truck had backed up directly to the brand-new $80,000 luxury SUV sitting proudly in the center of the driveway. The driver had already attached the heavy steel chains to the front axle, and the loud hydraulic winch was slowly dragging the massive heavy vehicle up onto the slanted metal ramp. Bradley ran out right behind her, his face flushed bright red with pure financial panic, begging the tow truck driver to stop the machine immediately. "You cannot take that," Chloe screamed hysterically, grabbing the side mirror of the luxury SUV as the winch pulled it higher and higher up the steep ramp. "That is my car. My father bought me that car. It is a completely legal gift." The tow truck driver ignored her, screaming calmly, reaching into his jacket to hand Bradley a printed legal repossession notice clearly stating that the vehicle had been purchased entirely with fraudulently wired funds, directly tied to an active federal grand larceny investigation. Bradley looked at the official paper and physically recoiled, pulling a kicking and screaming Chloe away from the moving truck. She fell heavily onto the manicured grass, kicking her expensive high heels against the cold pavement, sobbing loudly like a spoiled, demanding toddler as she watched her ultimate status symbol completely disappear. The tow truck driver secured the heavy steel chains turned on his bright, flashing yellow lights and roared loudly down the street, hauling the stolen vehicle away into the cool, dark winter evening. I watched from the absolute safety of the tall neighborhood hedges, breathing in the crisp evening air with perfectly clear lungs. The massive commercial moving vans closed their heavy rear metal doors, fully loaded with every single piece of luxury audiovisual equipment my parents had purchased with my dead husband's life insurance money. But the police officers had not left the property yet. The senior officer stepped out onto the front porch, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his dark utility belt. He looked directly at my father, who was still standing silently in the doorway, staring blankly at the completely empty space in the driveway where Chloe's car used to be. The officer loudly and clearly read Richard Miller his Miranda rights, ensuring every word echoed across the empty street. He told him he was under formal arrest for felony forgery and grand larceny against a minor. My father did not fight back. He did not yell or arrogantly brag about his financial acumen. He simply held out his wrists, completely defeated, broken, and permanently stripped of every single ounce of his arrogant pride. The heavy metal cuffs clicked shut with a sharp, distinct, and wonderfully final sound. The police officers gently led my father down the brick front steps, placing him carefully into the back of the dark blue police cruiser. My mother was still sitting hopelessly on the floor of the grand foyer, surrounded by the shattered, sparkling pieces of her crystal wine glass, weeping inconsolably into her perfectly manicured hands. Chloe and Bradley stood shivering on the front lawn, looking absolutely pathetic and financially ruined, knowing without a shadow of a doubt that their own personal bank accounts were going to be aggressively and ruthlessly audited next. The entire grand illusion of their perfect, wealthy, powerful suburban family had been violently and entirely destroyed in less than a single hour. They had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. Their personal money was completely frozen. Their stolen physical assets were gone. Their pristine social standing was completely annihilated, and my father was going straight to a federal holding cell for stealing from his own flesh and blood. I took one final satisfying look at the beautiful, massive brick house that had felt like a suffocating, terrifying prison for 10 agonizing months. I did not feel a single solitary ounce of pity for any of them. They had looked at my 10-year-old daughter weeping endlessly for her dead father and decided to rob her blind so they could drink fancy champagne and watch football in expensive heated leather chairs. They had viciously threatened to throw us out into the cold street when I simply asked to buy my child a laptop for school. They had repeatedly called me crazy and treated me like invisible, unpaid catering staff in my own childhood home. Now they were the ones who had absolutely nothing left in the entire world. I turned my back on the flashing blue and red police lights, pulling my warm winter coat tighter around my shoulders to block the cold wind. I walked quietly and confidently down the dark sidewalk, stepped back into my beat-up 10-year-old sedan, and happily started the engine. I drove back to my small, quiet apartment, where my brave, sweet daughter was waiting patiently for me, completely safe and entirely secure. The silent war was officially over. I had audited their corrupt souls, and I had left them totally, completely, and permanently bankrupt. The days following my father's arrest were a whirlwind of legal filings and absolute silence from my biological family. Jonathan Davis, the brilliant attorney who helped me secure the emergency asset freeze, did not leave a single stone unturned. The local prosecutor took one look at the pristine, high-resolution photographs I had taken of the forged withdrawal slips, cross-referenced them with the wire transfer receipts, and immediately moved forward with a grand jury indictment. Richard Miller was officially charged with multiple counts of felony forgery, grand larceny, and federal wire fraud. The sheer scale of the theft, $150,000, stolen directly from a grieving child's trust fund, eliminated any possibility of a quiet wrist slap. My parents had built their entire identity on the illusion of vast wealth and moral superiority. They had paraded around their suburban country club acting as though they were untouched by the financial struggles that plagued normal people. But the reality of their situation was laid bare for the entire community to witness. Their personal bank accounts remained completely frozen by the court order. They could not access a single zing to hire the high-powered defense attorney they desperately needed. Instead, my father had to swallow his massive, suffocating pride and rely on a court-appointed public defender for his initial arraignment. To avoid spending the next 10 years of his golden retirement in a federal prison cell, my father was forced to accept a brutal, devastating plea deal. The absolute condition of his freedom was total, immediate financial restitution to my daughter's trust account, plus the complete coverage of all my legal fees. My parents had to liquidate absolutely everything. The massive brick suburban house, the one with the grand foyer where my father had threatened to throw me out on the street, was put up for a rapid estate sale. All of their expensive imported furniture, my mother's precious designer handbags, and their matching luxury sedans were auctioned off to the highest bidder. The church ladies who used to praise my mother's charity eagerly attended the estate sale, whispering and gossiping as they bought her prized porcelain dishware for pennies on the dollar. My parents were forced to completely drain their actual retirement accounts, absorbing massive early withdrawal penalties, just to scrape together enough liquid cash to pay back the stolen funds. They downsized from their sprawling suburban estate into a tiny, cramped 2-bedroom rental apartment on the far outskirts of the city. The country club immediately revoked their platinum membership. The church community completely ostracized them. They had traded their entire social standing and financial security for a few months of stolen luxury. The fallout for my golden sister Chloe and her husband Bradley was equally catastrophic. Without my father's stolen cash injections to artificially prop up their lavish lifestyle, Bradley's contracting business completely collapsed within a matter of weeks. The commercial lenders officially called in all their debts. The bank repossessed their remaining work trucks. Their massive, heavily mortgaged suburban home went into immediate foreclosure. Chloe and Bradley were forced to formally file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Their credit completely ruined, their illusion of success entirely shattered. Meanwhile, Lily and I were finally truly breathing. The stolen $150,000 was successfully recovered and deposited back into a brand-new, ironclad trust account. Jonathan Davis restructured the legal framework of the trust so that absolutely no one, not even me, could withdraw a single cent without a signed court order until Lily turned 18 years old. Her future was permanently secured safe from anyone's greed or entitlement. I remember the exact morning Jonathan Davis called to tell me the recovered funds had officially cleared the wire transfer and settled securely into Lily's newly structured trust. I was sitting at my small kitchen table, drinking a cup of cheap coffee, and I just wept. They were not tears of sorrow or grief. They were tears of absolute, unadulterated relief. I had gone up against the very people who had controlled and terrified me for my entire life, and I had won. I had protected my child. Since the day of the repossession, I have not spoken a single word to my father, my mother, or my sister. They do not have my new phone number. They do not know where I live. The silence they left behind in my life is not lonely. It is the most beautiful, healing sound I have ever heard. I do not miss the tension. I do not miss the constant anxiety of waiting for the next cruel insult or the next unreasonable demand. I simply wake up every day, go to my job as a payroll specialist, and come home to a space that belongs entirely to us. Our new life is nothing like the grand cold mansion we left behind. We live in a modest, quiet 2-bedroom apartment. The walls are a little thin, and the floors creak when you walk too fast, but it is filled with warmth, laughter, and absolute peace. On Friday nights, we do not sit in heated leather recliners in a custom-built basement theater. We sit on a cheap second-hand fabric sofa. We pop a simple bag of microwave popcorn, throw a fuzzy fleece blanket over our legs, and watch animated movies on a basic, inexpensive television I bought on sale. And every single time I look over at my daughter's smiling face, illuminated by the glow of the screen, my heart swells with an overwhelming, profound joy. We are safe. We are happy, and we are finally free from the toxic, suffocating obligations of a family that never truly loved us. When I look back on everything that happened, from the devastating loss of my husband Tom to the horrifying betrayal by my own parents, I realize it was a brutal masterclass in the psychology of entitlement. For my entire life, I had been deeply conditioned to believe that family loyalty was an absolute, unbreakable contract. I was taught that you must always honor your parents, respect your elders, and sacrifice your own comfort to maintain the peace of the household. But the truth is, toxic people rely entirely on your shillings and your guilt to maintain their power. They weaponize the concept of family to extract whatever they want from you, whether it is your time, your energy, or your child's future. My parents looked at my profound grief and did not see a daughter in desperate need of comfort and support. They saw a weak, vulnerable target. They saw an opportunity. They believed that their age and their biological title gave them supreme authority over my life and my assets. They justified their monstrous theft by convincing themselves that they inherently deserved luxury more than a 10-year-old girl deserved a college education. That is the true, terrifying nature of narcissistic entitlement. It blinds people to the pain of others, allowing them to commit horrific acts of betrayal while sincerely believing they are the righteous heroes of their own story. But I learned a very hard, incredibly valuable lesson through all of this. Blood does not give anyone a free pass to exploit your tragedy. Sharing DNA with someone does not obligate you to endure their abuse, their manipulation, or their financial crimes. Setting firm, undeniable boundaries is not an act of betrayal against your family. It is an act of pure survival. It is the necessary process of building a fortress around the people you actually love and protecting the life you are trying to build. I spent 28 years trying to make myself small and invisible so my parents and my sister could feel big and important. I learned the hard way that my job on this earth is not to set myself on fire just to keep my parents' egos warm. My job is to protect my daughter. My job is to ensure that Lily grows up in a home where she is valued, respected, and entirely safe. Lily has blossomed in our new environment. Without the heavy, critical presence of her grandparents weighing her down, she has regained her joyful spirit. She focuses on her schoolwork, paints pictures, and laughs freely. She knows her father's legacy is safe, but more importantly, she knows her mother will fight like a lion to defend her. I am teaching her that true family is defined by actions, by safety, and by unwavering support, not by biological accidents or forced proximity. The generational curse ends right here with me in this modest little apartment. Breaking generational cycles of abuse and manipulation requires you to stand up, look the monsters right in the eye, and refuse to participate in their destructive games anymore. It requires you to gather your evidence, build your trap, and execute your exit strategy without a single ounce of hesitation or guilt. If they wanted a loyal, submissive daughter, they should not have tried to rob her blind in her darkest hour. If you are watching this video right now and you find yourself constantly drained, manipulated, or emotionally abused by the people who demand your absolute loyalty, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You are not crazy. You are not overly sensitive. And you are certainly not obligated to accept their toxic behavior just because they are your parents, your siblings, or your in-laws. You have the right to walk away. You have the right to gather your things, secure your finances, and build a quiet, peaceful life far away from their suffocating control. You deserve to sit on a cheap sofa, eat microwave popcorn, and feel completely, wonderfully safe. Now I want to hear from all of you. If you have ever had to step up and fiercely protect your children from the very people who were supposed to be their loving grandparents, I want you to share your experience in the comments below. If you have ever had to legally enforce a boundary against toxic family members, or if you have ever had to walk away from a family dynamic that was slowly destroying your spirit, tell me how you did it. Your stories matter. Your survival matters. Reading about your strength helps others realize they are not alone in this fight. Also, please let me know exactly where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. I always love seeing how far these stories reach across the world. If my story gave you even a small ounce of the courage you need to finally stand up for yourself, please do me a huge favor and hit that like button right now. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story about justice healing and taking your absolute power back from the people who tried to steal it. We are building a community of survivors here, and your support helps these videos reach the exact people who need to hear them today. Never forget that you are the sole author of your own life. You have the absolute authority to decide who gets a seat at your table and who gets locked outside in the cold. Do not let toxic people dictate your worth. Do not let entitled family members manipulate your grief. And most importantly, remember that you hold the pen to your own story. Do not ever let anyone else forge your signature. Thank you so much for listening. Stay safe, stay strong, and I will see you in the next video.